This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Can I start by wishing everyone who is celebrating today a very happy Eid. On our agenda today is a discussion of emerging fire hazards in London. Before we begin, we have a few small items of business. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Hall, for whom Assemblymember Best will be substituting, and in accordance with Standing Order 2.4, Assemblymember Bukhari will attend the meeting virtually today.
Thank you for that. And can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Noted. And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Take silence as there are none. And can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of May 2023? Agreed. And can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent? Noted. That was a noting, thank you. And can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority in consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's letter to the Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire regarding the disclosure and barring service checks? Okay, and we now move on to the main item, a discussion on emerging fire hazards in London. I would like to introduce our meeting guests. We have Charlie Pugsley, Assistant Commissioner, Fire Safety of the London Fire Brigade. Dom Ellis, Deputy Commissioner and Operational Director for Prevention, Protection and Operational Policy at the LFB. Baroness Twycross, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. Dan Daly, Head of Continuous Improvement, National Fire Chiefs Council. Lucy Grenville, Safety and Law Enforcement Liaison, Tier Mobility. Dan Parsons, Director, Fully Charged E-Bikes. And finally, Stephen Kurtler, Product Safety Manager, Electrical Safety First. Before the discussion begins, please can I remind guests that microphones should only be moved from the base, and also ask you to position your microphones close to you and adjust the gooseneck angle as necessary in order that you may be heard clearly in the chamber and on the webcast. So that's move it like this, as opposed to picking it up, if that's all right. Okay, so I will take the lead-off questions, which are to the London Fire Brigade. Since 2018, there has been an increase in the number of fires attended by the LFB where lithium-ion was believed to be the cause. How do you see this risk developing, given the continued rise in the number of lithium-ion batteries in London?
Good morning, Chair, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about this emerging risk, not only in London, but nationally and internationally. As I'm sure you've seen with our hashtag Charge Safe campaign, we've seen a 60% rise in e-bike and e-scooter fires, particularly e-bike fires in London so far this year compared to the same period last year. And of course, we had our first fatality on New Year's Day in the Old Kent Road, tragically losing a young lady, 21-year-old Sophia Duarte, whose mother, Maria, and family friend, Alda, have been, we've got to pay tribute. They've been really brave in helping us with our campaign to really bring this to life for our communities, and they may attend later in the gallery. So we've been really trying to maximise this Charge Safe campaign, because a 60% increase with this is something to be concerned about. If you've been following the hashtag Charge Safe campaign, you'll see the ferocity and the speed of these fires. And I mentioned the kind of international concern. We've been following New York City, and they've had over 100% increase in fatalities compared to last year. They had 6 fatalities linked to e-bikes last year. They've had 13 so far this year. 4 of those last Tuesday in an e-bike repair shop with residents above, 4 fatalities in that fire. Which also reignited 2 days later, which gives some of the challenges with these e-batteries, in that you're never sure when they're out, and the kind of legacy management challenges it gives us. So all round, we're really concerned that it's a bit of a potential societal blind spot when it comes to hazard and risk for us. So we're really concerned about it. We want to do all we can to work with all partners to make sure the wider community understand the challenges with these and understand how to own them, charge them, and use them safely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. The term societal blind spot, I think, accurately describes the situation and the seriousness of this situation. But lots of products we use, I mean, including products on this very desk, have lithium-ion batteries and in our daily lives, in our rucksacks, and all sorts of places. Are there any sort of products that you're more concerned about than others, and why?
Well, particularly e-bikes, and out of e-bikes, it's the e-bikes with retrofit kits is where we're seeing a real increase in fires. We would encourage anyone that's considering an e-bike as a suitable and sustainable form of transport to buy it from a reputable dealer, where you're guaranteed about the provenance of the bike and the battery and the charger that it comes with. We are concerned about some of the batteries and kits that are being bought on online marketplaces that aren't regulated. You can't be guaranteed about the provenance of those batteries, but of course these aren't cheap. So if you are buying them from a recognised dealer, these are at least £2,000 for a bike, and a substantial investment if you want a second battery to kind of give you greater travel distance. So it's really that kind of area that is our chief concern, and where we've seen the biggest rise in these fires. And again, I think that's borne out by the international examples that we're seeing as well.
Thanks for that. And how is the LFB changing over the past 5 years in terms of plans and resourcing to combat these fires?
Well, the first bit is the hashtag Charge Safe campaign to inform our communities and our firefighters actually of the hazards when it comes to dealing with these. And we're servicing that through our local borough risk management plans, so that our local crews are taking real ownership of the risk and how that applies to their local boroughs, whether it be gig economy within their local boroughs or the high-rise risk within their local boroughs. You'll see in our community risk management plan there's a specific section on sustainability and climate change and how we're working with the kind of developments and increased challenge really in that environment. And there's programs of work in our delivery plan, one of them specifically around alternate fuels, so that we can try and be at the cutting edge of this emerging risk and the fire service's response to that emerging risk actually, because it's evolving worldwide and we need to be linked in with that. Also working with our National Fire Chief Council colleagues who have some excellent training packages and have an industry lead on this, just making sure we're connected in every way we can be to keep our firefighters as safe in responding to these risks, but more importantly, or as importantly, the prevention and protection piece, really trying to stop it happening in the first place, or if it does happen, informing our communities as how best to respond. Because the point I'd make again, and I'm sure those of you that have seen the videos, is just how quick and ferocious these fires are, and the lack of response time you and your family will have if these are in your home. And I think that's the key risk really. Chair, you referred to, we've all got lithium-ion devices on our desks here. I've got 3 in front of me. Some of us may have battery charging packs in our bags, but they're probably from a known provenance and they're regulated, but they're small enough that if this was to catch fire, I could throw it over there and we could control it. With e-bikes and e-scooters, the amount of energy in those battery packs is sufficient to really kind of compromise a good-sized double bedroom in 10 to 15 seconds. And it's the intimacy of the risk that's the key concern here, because people have these charging in their hallways, or a lot of the gig economy people, of course, they've got them, and the evidence is showing, they've got them in their bedsits, in their HMOs. So it's at the end of their bed. And they're probably charging while they sleep because they've just done a 14-hour shift and they need to get back out there again. So it's the intimacy of this risk that is the key concern for us, and while we really need to inform people so that they understand the speed, the ferocity of these fires, and they plan for it.
Thank you for that. And just before we move on, this is quite maybe a bit of a basic question, but why is it that lithium-ion batteries, why are the fires so different to other fires?
I think what's good about lithium-ion is it's probably the most densely packed power source. It's the most efficient battery, which is why there's so many uses for it. But of course, when it goes wrong, it's exactly that gives us the challenges, because it's such a densely packed power source. And I think a really good exemplar video of this was the fire we had in May in Putney, where the gentleman, his bike was in his flat on the 3rd floor in a high-rise block. He smelt what smelt like nail varnish remover, which is the chemical decomposition of the battery going into thermal runaway. He took it out, I don't know if you've seen the video, it really is worth a watch. He took it out into the means of escape lobby, which is the size of a big double bedroom, I'd say. And within 15 seconds, that whole lobby was compromised by a vapour gas cloud explosion. Now, the first emissions of when these batteries start to fail looks as innocent as steam. So the temptation could be, it's just steam, I'll go and move it. That is a highly toxic, flammable vapour gas cloud. And that can flash over very quickly into a whole compartment fire. The jet flames that come out of this chemical reaction, we think are between 1,000 and 2,000 degrees, so it's seriously hot. And when it explodes, bit of molten metal are sprayed across the room. And of course, if that's in a bedroom or a front room, that will set fire to combustibles within the room. So it's just that amount of energy in that densely packed space that when it goes wrong is a real challenge for us and can compromise quite a large space, so a means of escape or an escape hallway. Does that answer your question,
It
Chair?
does. Thank you very much. I'll move on now to Assemblymember Bailey.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find. So let me start with this. Has the London Resilience Forum discussed the issue of lithium-ion battery fire risk?
That was directed at me.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
So the London Resilience Forum meeting wouldn't normally discuss issues this granular. So the actual LRF formal meeting would discuss wider risks and responses. So they might discuss a framework to deal with a major fire, which is one of the sort of, or high-rise fire, which is one of the sort of national risk register risks, where the LRF partners would discuss the lithium-ion battery risks would be on the sector panel meetings and between LRF partners, so not necessarily through that formal meeting, but through the ongoing discussion. So, for example, LFB discusses regularly with TfL, discusses regularly with the MPS issues around safe storage of e-scooters following confiscation and so forth. So there is that sort of discussion, but it isn't something that we've had a specific meeting or item on at the formal LRF meeting.
Do you know what sort of discussions they've been having at that level? Because I think the two things that are worrying about this is the ubiquity of the devices and the coming size. Because if you have an electric bus, I'm assuming it's going to have an enormous battery in it. And if we take the comments made by Mr. Ellis, it sounds like a bomb.
So I think that I'll leave the fire brigade to talk about what the implications would be of fire in a bus. But I think what he described was actually the consequences of having something go up in flames in somebody's bedroom potentially, and how intimate that space is. And can talk through some of the sort of issues around bus fires separately. I think that so the level of discussion would have been really quite intense between different partners. So LFB's conversations with TfL would be considerable and ongoing. And you'd have those. There'd be people in Charlie Pugsley's team who would be having those conversations on a almost daily basis, and would draw in sort of the national piece, because obviously it's a national issue, it's not just a London issue, and would draw in conversations with the National Fire Chiefs Council as well. So I think what I would say, though, is that I think that we, as well as highlighting the risks, we also need to highlight what can be done about the risks. So, for example, the issues that happened with a well-known brand of not iPhones, it wasn't iPhones, was it? It was Samsung. A few years ago, that was then resolved. So we know about the issue. It's really important technology in terms of achieving the 80% target within the Mayor's strategy, transport strategy on active travel or using public travel in London. And that's really important within that sort of wider London context. So I think what I'm interested in is what regulation we can have to avoid people getting the dodgy batteries that are going to cause problems. And that charge safe campaign isn't about not having things that you would charge or would need to charge or could use to and there'll be people in this room, including myself, who've got e-bikes, but it's about how you maintain the equipment you've got and how you store it and how you charge it safely so that you can use it responsibly within your life as somebody who actually wants to have active travel as part of your life. So I think, yes, the LOF partners would have had very detailed, regular conversations about it, but the LRF meeting as a whole hasn't had that discussion.
I understand, because the LRF meetings seem to be a bit more
They're quite
strategic
high level,
and high level.
Yeah.
I just make a bit of a plea, because 4, 5, 10 years down the line, this might be the only power source, and we do need a sort of strategic response to it. Because if you had 2 or 3 bus fires, but we didn't have the capacity within the brigade to deal with fires of that level of this nature, we could have a drama.
I think that the training that firefighters undertake, I will pass back to the LFB actually, because the training that firefighters would include how to deal with that type of fire. So I'll hand back to Dom and...
let me specifically ask you that question.
Yeah. Is that all right?
And then we can go. Yes, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. So are you content that emergency responders are sufficiently trained and prepared to deal with the risk of lithium-ion battery fires? And I ask that in particular, and I'm more interested in the larger batteries at this point, buses, because your explanation is slightly worrying for a phone, and a bus would be hundreds of times larger. And you talk about intimacy. As a bus passenger, I'd effectively sat in that battery. So are you content with the training and the equipment you have to deal with that?
Never content, because this is the cutting edge of innovation in more sustainable ways of travel, and we need to be at that front edge of that innovation. But our firefighters are well trained. They've used the NFCC materials in how to respond to lithium-ion, amongst many other types of alternative fuel incidents, and they understand the risks. And we have had incidents in buses, and you've probably seen that there have been incidents internationally as well. So I am content that they understand the risks and that they are sufficiently trained, but there's always more we can do, and we are connected in at the kind of innovative end of developing our response as industry starts to provide equipment that will help us respond into these compartments. The challenge with these, whether it's a car or a bus, is you extinguish the car or the bus, but you then have the thermal runaway within the battery compartment. And the challenge is cutting into that battery compartment and sort of extinguishing that, flooding the battery compartment, if you like. And it looks like, and we have them in London, that the way to deal with that is high-pressure lance systems with a kind of cutting aggregate in them that cuts through the casing and then allows you to flood that battery casing whilst insulating the firefighter from any shock hazards. So that's at the cutting edge. We're looking at that. We have a couple of those kits in London, so we can respond to these types of incidents. But it is something we and other international brigades are watching with interest and seeing where the kind of firefighting innovation takes us, really.
Okay. Maybe I'll address this question to Mr. Daly. Is there anything that manufacturers can do to help in this particular instance? And again, I'm focusing on the larger batteries in cars and buses, etc.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the response from fire and rescue services is always a reactive measure, and I think the answer here is actually to get into research and development and work with manufacturers on how to best enable firefighters to respond. Now, some manufacturers for cars, for instance, equip those cars with what we call a firefighting port, which allows water to be applied directly into the battery compartment when that's the case. Now, why that isn't a standard is an issue for me, because I think that's a very easy and effective way for firefighters to be able to tackle one of those fires. In terms of the general methodologies, there's still a lot of research to be done, because we've talked about blankets to suppress fires, and the pros and cons of that approach. We've got immersion tanks being used in some countries where literally a whole vehicle is encased in a tank, which is then flooded with water to effectively extinguish the fire. But the issues with that, you've then got a large containment of what is now contaminated water, and who owns the responsibility for dealing with the runoff and the issues from that. One of the most effective methods at the moment is considered to be a controlled burn. But of course, depending on where you are, particularly in built-up areas like LFB, it's not actually that reasonable to leave a fire burning for a large period of time with a disruption to business and local communities that provides. So I think R&D is the way forward, with manufacturers taking more responsibility. That's where the money is, to really research the impacts of what could be more effective and what could improve the safety. And that R&D, of course, not just about how we react to fires, but how do we make these things safer in the first place.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor, I'm gonna read you this question just to prepare. Data on lithium-ion battery fires is not publicly available other than through Freedom of Information Act request. Will the LFB publish this data on these fires and on a regular basis in the future, in the interest of transparency and increasing awareness around the issue?
Sorry, I'm going to ask you. So you're saying the data on the fires isn't publicly available?
Yeah.
I think that the LFB does have that, and it's not the intention that would only be available through FOIs. So, you've got that information today and was prepared to say it to the committee. So we can just make sure that is published in an appropriate place on the LFB's website, because I think there is an interest in that. To be honest, they've got so much data that sometimes things get buried, not intentionally. But I think we can definitely make sure the committee has that, and we'll look at where that's published on the website.
Okay, thank you. And just one small question, maybe to Mr. Ellis more than anybody else. What prevention measures do you have in place for these fires? I know you've talked about your campaign. Is there anything other than that you're speaking to people about or trying to make happen?
We're working closely.
I think you need to turn your mic on.
Forgive me. We're working closely with all key stakeholders. We've had meetings with government, with OPSS, with others, just to try and maximise the knowledge and the understanding about these risks, and just make sure that all concerned parties are pulling in the right direction. I think Charlie can probably come in about how we're influencing the built environment and planning applications when it comes to these areas. But as Dan said, I think our key influence is trying to regulate so that there's a better understanding about the hazards with these batteries, and that they are designed or all designed to an appropriate standard. I think the key probably with these batteries is the battery management systems that keeps them safe. The reason why our phones don't catch fire regularly, you don't see that as an issue, because the battery management systems in there will cut out at 60 degrees. They're really efficient, and we need that kind of efficiency and rigour across all areas of battery
Sorry
provision.
to interrupt you. Is anybody pursuing that? Is anybody saying let's have standards for e-scooters, buses?
Yes, absolutely. Charlie, did you want to come in there? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're working with the Office of Product Safety and Standards. We have quarterly meetings to share data, because London has the best data set nationally because of our fire investigation and our scientific advisor capacity. So we're doing that on a live basis to just try and make sure that we can highlight where the gaps are as early as possible. We do make the point that if you see one fire, there may well be several other fires nationally that the regulator is not aware of. So we're also linking up through Dan's team and NFCC, working with other fire and rescue services to share their data as well. But even then, we don't think it will be the complete picture. And just coming back to your question on what we're doing to help people as well, I think just to reiterate Dom's point, we're just trying to help people understand about making products safe at the point of sale so that they're not counterfeit and they do meet the safety standards. And that's why our real concern is with the online marketplace, because it's not like a retailer, it's basically a third party just selling on, if you like, a marketplace or platform. Our home fire safety checker has been updated with specific advice around electric small vehicles, e-scooters, e-bikes. Our home fire safety visits are taking that into account. And we're also just in the process of finalising guidance for responsible persons on things they can consider in their buildings to help make it safer, because this is something we have to live with. So what can we do to actually help people with useful advice in the absence of clear standards?
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to take Assembly Member Bakari, who's online.
Thank you. Eid Mubarak, everybody. I'm very sorry that I'm not with you today. I'm missing my mum's Eid breakfast so that I can do this meeting for you today, because I'm very passionate about this subject. I've been campaigning on this for a while. Back in January 2022, I first asked the Mayor about a public awareness campaign on this particular issue. So I'm really pleased that the LFB have now started the Charge Safe campaign, but I'm incredibly sad that it took the death of poor Sophia in New Year's Day for that action to have taken place, and I understand the reasons for that, and why policy is dependent on this kind of evidence approach. But it is incredibly sad that we've had to lose a life for the movement on this particular issue. And back in January 2022, I was raising the issue that we were just hearing from earlier about the lack of awareness, particularly on adapting bikes at home. So I want to go back into the question earlier that we were talking about training, which you just alluded to just earlier about home visits. I asked that a while ago in the last FREP meeting to Jonathan Smith about home visits and whether they were including detailed conversations about lithium-ion batteries and particular safety discussions on bikes and how to charge them and store them, and the discussion on buying online batteries within the home visits that you're doing. So at that point, Jonathan wasn't able to give me a clear answer. Could you give me an answer now in terms of the update on training for firefighters to make sure that those home visits do include those conversations? And I'm going to target that question to either Dom, Ellis, if that's possible.
Thank you, Assembly Member. I'll just pass that one to Charlie Pugsley, who will give you the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. You're right, it is a very challenging thing for us to do, and part of the reason the Charge Safe has got those clear points is to really assist our firefighters, because when we go into the home there are many different types of risks, so we want to make sure we can give really simple, clear messaging that can help our communities with those key points. So rather than talking about things like thermal runaway, we're trying to focus on think about your exit route, think about charging, safe storage. So again, there's just a range of key points that we think will be far more effective in terms with our communities, and then we can always signpost for more detailed information. And then that way, I think, particularly with our really rich, diverse communities, we can just make sure we're more effective, because these are fairly simple steps we're trying to advise people on.
So, Charlie, I mean, I've talked to you about this before, but I'm really concerned about the lack of awareness, not just in terms of people buying online, but also just generally, in terms of councillors, for example. Now, I'm a local councillor, and I think when I've done home inspections, we look out for push chairs, things that might be blocking access, things like that. Are we going to start using the evidence that now we have on lithium-ion batteries and e-bikes included in home inspections, and make sure that councils, councillors, housing associations are all included in this conversation, just so that we can get that message across?
I think that's a really fair point, and our borough commanders are really leading the way through our borough risk management plans, and we've seen great evidence in some boroughs in particular where it will be on community notice boards, on community visual aids, things like that, again repeating the charge safe. But not only that, our firefighters have been meeting local communities, gig economy and retailers to try and actively promote the message there, and we've even done work with the Bicycle Association to try and get in at the, if you like, the wholesale, because we strongly believe there's no single point of cure for this. I think, as the Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner have said, it's a wide-ranging issue, so as you say, we have to try and come in from as many angles as possible to try and build that awareness when people's lives are so busy thinking about other things.
Charlie, again, I want to talk a little bit further about this, about reputable companies though as well. This is a really fast-paced industry. Things are changing all the time, and safety concerns are paramount when it comes to making sure that people are buying from reputable companies. Within the progress that you're making in terms of your investigations to make sure that you're up to date, are you also keeping up to date to making sure that people that you're talking to within these groups know about the reputable companies as well?
We have to be careful that we don't endorse particular companies as a public service, so we do have to sort of tread carefully around that area, but we do try to give people clear advice around reputable retailers that can be online as well as in the high street or in our communities. So yes, we are sort of pushing that. We're also working, we mentioned earlier, with the Office of Product Safety and Standards in terms of trying to give information where possible about where people have bought products from, and that has resulted in Office of Product Safety and Standards through Trading Standards doing a couple of, I don't know if raid's the right term, but surveillance, and then going in an enforcement action, which has actually led to products being seized. But I think the challenge is, particularly with the cost of living crisis, many of our communities will, with the price of these things, look for the best value. And this comes back to why we believe that the action urgently needed is for the online marketplace, because we need to support people who've got different spending abilities, but then we need to do that in a way that's safe as well. And that's why we're urging Office of Product Safety and Standards to act on the data we've got at the moment and to keep up that work.
Great. Well, I know that we're talking about that further, but thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning to the panel. I just wanted to put some questions to Lucy from TIR. You recently sent, let me just pull out my questions. You recently sent the Labour Group a copy of your fire safety operations document, which we were pleased to receive, and you explained your approach to battery safety, and it's underpinned by 6 principles. So I was hoping you could talk with the committee through those principles and how you keep your batteries safe. Switch your mic on, thank you.
Thank you, sorry. I can certainly talk to you about the safety of our service. So the main thing that keeps our service safe is the battery design. So our batteries catch fire for 2 main reasons, that's my understanding, which is damage to the batteries by an impact or short circuits within the battery cells. And that's usually during charging. So our batteries have a battery management system which monitors the voltage, temperature and current and gives information to us as an operator about how that battery is functioning, so that we can decide whether to take it out of service or leave it in service. And there's various different error messages that it gives. Secondly, they're extremely robust. These batteries live out on the street all day in all weathers, and sometimes get abused by members of the public. They're very robust. They have a double aluminium casing and an inner silicone lining which makes them waterproof and also absorbs some shock. And they're IP67 rated as well. They're temperature rated from -20 to +60 degrees, and they meet UN 38.3 standard for lithium-ion batteries and IC 62133, which is an international safety testing standard. So we're quite confident in the safety of our batteries. Our vehicles also detect unsafe batteries, failed batteries, so our vehicles just become inactive if there's any issue with the battery or it's not secure in the housing. we also have a company that recycles our batteries. I can continue to talk about our operation as well, if that's...
Yeah, and please also feel free to elaborate on the other principles as well.
So, safe operation storage is very important to us. Our batteries are very easy to use because we need them to be able to be used by our rangers safely wherever they are. They're designed for quick and easy swapping on the street. We have a fireproof battery room with CCTV and staff always on site. We have external approved storage boxes to store decommissioned batteries away from batteries inside the warehouse. Prior to recycling, we also have a big water and salt tank, and if anybody suspects that there's a battery that's an issue, they can drop it in there. It stays in there for 10 days until it comes out for recycling. We have visits by London Fire Brigade. They've come and visited our warehouse in the past couple of times. And obviously staff training is very important to us. They have training, onboarding and regular training throughout to make sure that everybody's transporting and handling batteries safely.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Now, obviously with the e-scooter trials guidance for rental operators, it says that the vehicle and its components of the electrical system, including the battery, shall so be designed, constructed and fitted as to minimise and protect against the risk of electrolyte leakage, fire, explosion and electrical shock, and ensure electromagnetic compatibility. Now, I think you've gone some way in telling us how you meet those standards, although please feel free to elaborate. But also, can you tell us how those standards are enforced by boroughs?
That's a good question. For e-scooters in particular, it's Transport for London who manages the trial, and who we have regular safety meetings with Transport for London, who hold us to account for every incident that happens and and our operation as well. So we meet very regularly with them, and they ask us questions. We tell them about any incidents that we've had, in collisions and fire incidents. That we haven't had any fire incidents yet in the UK with our batteries. In terms of boroughs, for the scooter trial, boroughs talk to TfL. In terms of our bikes, we have different agreements with different boroughs, different tender requirements, different MOUs. So it just depends a little bit on the borough as to what requirements they have for us. But we meet with them regularly as well to answer their questions.
Thank you. Could you give us an example of an incident that's happened where you've had to work with the borough in terms of enforcement?
In terms of enforcement for?
If there's been an incident in regards to the quality of the battery.
There haven't been any incidents in terms of the quality of the battery. We had, at the beginning of the trial, we had people very interested in our scooters and particularly the batteries, and we had a couple of incidents where batteries were attacked. On one occasion, it looked like someone had taken a angle grinder to the top of the battery, but there was no fire. It was just damaged and obviously got dealt with safely in the warehouse.
Okay, and in that instance, for instance, when it's been damaged, that then poses a fire risk, I imagine.
It did provide, yes, it did, yeah.
And so in that instance, what was done?
So the vehicle was brought back, the battery was put in a safe storage in the van, the vehicle was brought back and it was made safe in the warehouse and then recycled by our partner.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. And just on my final question, so the London Council has produced a memorandum of understanding for dockless e-bike operators such as yourself. Are you able to tell us if that memorandum or any existing contracts you have with boroughs has similar guidance on battery safety? So does it align with your own?
I haven't seen that, I'm afraid.
Okay. I was wondering if anyone else in the panel can comment on that then. We might have to get some follow-up information from you regarding that, if that's all right, Lucy. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, and actually, I think my final question, so more broadly, sort of less to do with those managing it, but more broadly for Londoners, what would your best advice, and I'll open this up to also Dan as well, what would your best advice for Londoners be in the general public on how to get safe e-bikes?
I think the rental service is very safe for Londoners, both scooters and e-bikes. I can't comment very knowledgeably about the safety of private e-bikes, but I'm sure my colleague can. But I think the service that we operate in London for bikes and scooters is really safe and a good alternative. Thank you, Lucy. Dan?
Yeah, and I thank you for the opportunity and taking part in this really important discussion. I think, you know, from our side of things, it's ensuring that potential consumers do speak to experts and get advice from reputable points of purchase. that they check labelling on product. It's important that the product displays labelling such as CE marking and product conformity. It's other things like buying quality product from reputable manufacturers and retailers. Following manufacturers' instructions is incredibly important also. And that if a product is malfunctioning, it's not to be used, and that they are to seek expert advice in that. One of, I think, the biggest problems that I see is the fact that I strongly believe that electric bikes and electric cargo bikes specifically are part of our solution to decarbonisation, and we are therefore needing and wanting more of these in the market, and creating a greater problem for ourselves as a result of that with those. But it's very important for me and others to delineate between good product and bad product. And it's been mentioned already this morning about the prevalence of product from irreputable manufacturers and those that are assembled by DIY persons. So it is very possible to buy an incredibly cheap battery online. It's not just the battery that you require to make an electric bicycle or indeed an electric scooter or any electric vehicle work. You need a controller, you need motor, you need wiring between those things, and you need some expertise to put them together properly and safely. Now, it's very likely that the cheap battery purchased, cheap in every connotation, does not have a battery management system on board. We've already heard the benefits of a battery management system. And if it's assembled by somebody that doesn't necessarily know what they're doing, that's where this issue is caused. My concern as a retailer who is trying to increase the prevalence of electric vehicles on our roads is that electric bicycles are getting tarred with the same brush, essentially. And there's some bad communication. You always look in the press to see that it's e-bikes that are dangerous. That's where we need to kind of draw a line and delineate between the good and the bad. And I would like to understand how much detail we have in the data of the fires as to which are good and which are bad that are at fault. And I think we would find that it's mostly the bad that are causing of the issues.
Thank you. Sorry, continue.
No,
thank you. I mean, I agree with you. It's a balance, isn't it? And it's, it is part of the decarbonisation sort of strategy and solution, but it's also about tackling the emerging risk that comes from it. And so to that end, to sort of circle back to the original question in terms of what you're doing to inform Londoners and the general public, sort of the educational sort of top lines you've given us, how is it that you promote that? At what point would a Londoner or someone in the public come across that information from you?
So this is where it becomes very difficult as well, is because a privately funded, relatively small entity, we have only a certain voice, and we have little funding to do what we would like to do to get this message out. If anybody that's in my LinkedIn, I've been campaigning on this for a couple of years now. I've been speaking with Hina and others on the subject, and including the Bicycle Association, who I brought it to their attention for the fears of misconstrued communication prior. We have blogs on our website. There are limited efforts that we are able to go to do that, but we do ensure that only the product that we bring into our business has been regulated. And to my knowledge, none of our manufacturers have ever had an issue with their batteries, or should I say, a non-damaged battery.
Okay, thank you, Dan. I'll pass over back to the chair.
Thank you for that. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. It's already been a really interesting conversation, and actually I've learnt lots, such as I didn't know that batteries smelt like nail varnish when there's about to be a serious problem, and I feel like just that alone is really important for people to know. Just before I get into my main questions, I was really intrigued by this idea that batteries on phones cut out at 60%. I think I've certainly had the experience, I'm sure fellow colleagues have, of the phone saying it's getting too hot, it's going to turn itself off. That's because I'd like to think I've got a reputable phone, but presumably lots of people don't have reputable phones. phones. Why is this not an issue that we know of with mobile phones, but is an issue with e-bikes or e-scooters? Is it just to do with the size of the battery?
I'll make a start on that. Thank you. I think most phones are from reputable providers, and we're not seeing the evidence of issues with phone fires. But equally, I suspect even if it was an issue, it's the kind of thing that you pick up and throw in a sink or put to one side and doesn't become such a big issue for you. Whereas the key bit with the size of battery on e-scooters and e-bikes is just the amount of energy packed into that battery. It's the battery size that you're bringing into your home that I think is the kind of key differentiation with the emerging risk that we see here. Is there anything you'd like to add, Charlie?
Yeah, and also some of the larger volume, as Dom said, you get packed in a e-bike conversion kit, for example. It might be made up of small cells like AA batteries. I don't know if you remember the hoverboards of a few years ago, the craze there, balance boards. We found there, we were working with trading standards, a similar technology, lithium batteries in a small package, same kind of thing, and they were actually branded batteries, but they were counterfeit. So they were a big name that we would all know. But through the research, we actually found that they were not that, and therefore the batteries didn't have the, if you like, the same standards or level of safety, which again is part of the challenge.
That's pretty worrying. So you both need a reputable company, and for that reputable company not to have been counterfeited as well.
Yeah, I just think there's more traceability through a reputable company rather than anonymous third party on an online marketplace that doesn't have that direct responsibility that is comparable with normal retailers. So there's definitely an imbalance, and we're looking forward to the product safety review coming out, we hope as soon as possible, and we also hope that will address some of those issues.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, if I can turn to you. I want to ask about the ban on TfL on e-scooters. Were you consulted on that decision, and do you think it's fair?
I think the ban on e-scooters is clearly comes into operational. So I think that the and it's about safety underground, and it's about people not necessarily having a right to use e-bikes. So obviously the law around e-bikes and e-scooters is slightly different. So e-scooters, you're talking about the e-scooter ban.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So the e-scooters, as far as I understand, are only private e-scooters are illegal and should only be ridden on private land. So all the e-scooters we see sort of skirting down the roads, a large number of them are illegal. So I think that it's right that there's a trial, but I think that the whole contested space around it has to be done within the sort of context of the law. So I haven't directly been involved in discussions around whether they should be banned. I'm aware and support the position as they are, but I can't imagine anyone would want to see some of these fires on the public transport network, which we've seen images of before. So it feels eminently sensible, but I think this is something that we'd better up. I can ask Seb Dance or Will Norman to come back with a clearer response on it. But this was made in discussion with the London Fire Brigade in the context of having a wider trial. So I think it's probably better if I can ask Seb and Will to get response to you on that, if that's helpful.
I understand, and I understand part of this is for Transport Committee, but when we say skirting around the roads too, I always worry that we don't talk about cars in that sense, and actually they're the most dangerous thing on the road. But I know we're talking about batteries now, so I don't want to take us down a complete...
I think that as somebody who does drive a car occasionally, I would think responsibly. I think that anyone who drives has had people pull out immediately in front of them irresponsibly. So I think, I'm not saying that cars aren't an issue in terms of safety, but I think that so people who go down roads unlit on their private e-scooters are presenting a hazard, and it's right that we should be aware of that and distinguish that from a reputable trial. There's two distinct group of people who are using e-scooters, and not everyone is using them responsibly.
I think we're agreeing entirely. And
I think we are.
We've all had emails as well of older people or disabled people who are also worried of people scooting on the pavement. So
absolutely.
It's about making sure people are in the appropriate space. But I always want to make sure the balance is right, that road traffic is often the most dangerous. Dan?
So I'd just like to add a little bit, if I may, because again, it comes down to delineation at a product level. To my understanding, there is far greater legislation surrounding electric bicycle manufacture than there is e-scooter and e-unicycle manufacture, which notoriously are cheaper products constructed with cheaper materials and the likes. A reputable electric bike manufacturer, I mean, from experience, having designed and initiated tests of testing standards and analyse those standards, there are a large number of standards that you must run through. Bicycle safety standards. There is an EPAC, electric pedal assisted cycle standard, which in itself contains standards associated to the Machinery Directive, to the CE certification and others. Lots of hoops that you need to jump through to be able to get your electric bicycle to the market, and those don't necessarily exist in the same prevalence to e-scooters and e-unicycles and other smaller forms of transport. So I think that's important to note also.
Thank you very much. Deputy Commissioner, if I can turn to you. So the Deputy Mayor there briefly referred to e-bikes, and I know that you want to, so you've written to the train companies to suggest that they look in their fire safety measures at e-bikes. Does that mean you'd like to see this ban on TfL extended to e-bikes also?
So we worked with TfL for, as I'm sure you're aware, for the e-scooters and e-unicycles, and that was following fires at Parsons Green and Stanmore stations back in 2021, I think. So we highlighted the risks and hazards to TfL, and in those cases they made the decision to implement a ban. We meet with them regularly, so the Transport Liaison group that work for Report to Charlie meet with TfL regularly and share our data and information on the hazards, so that they're aware of them. The decision as to whether they actually implement a ban, as some train companies have, is down to TfL. But as the gentleman here said, I think maybe some of the bikes that are being transported on TfL are the folding type that are made to a higher standard. I think they have restrictions on fixed bikes because they may be linked to aftermarket retro kits. So I don't think it's for me to call for a ban. Our position is to advise the operator about the risks and the hazards. I'm not aware of a fire involving an e-bike on TfL thus far. And when we did have the discussions and TfL decided to implement the ban, that was following the e-scooter fires, which is, as Dan's alluded to, sometimes are made from cheaper materials.
Thank you. Chair, I have some more questions about decarbonisation, but I think I'm going to come back because Assemblymember Duval's going to come in at this point, I think.
Assemblymember Duval.
Thank you very much. Can we just go back and clarify further? So I think I understand it's not your job to ban, it's to advise or provide evidence for those to make the decision. So in terms of the role that you played within the review of TfL's decision making is what? You provided your evidence that supported their actions. Is that how it works officially?
Yeah, so we provided the evidence because obviously we respond and deal with the emergency when it happens. The emergency's been at, the evidence we had was Parsons Green. You've probably seen the footage of that example that affected a carriage, and at Stanmore. And then through our advising of the risk assessment, it's down to the company to feed that into their risk assessment and their working practices. And in that case, they chose to implement a ban for e-scooters and e-unicycles.
Okay, and just to go forward, TfL decided not to ban e-bikes, and I think you alluded to earlier why you thought that was the case, but not every e-bike is of the same standard, because we've heard that in earlier contributions that you've made. Do you think they pose less of a risk than scooters and unicycles?
Well, I think our evidence earlier is that we've seen a 60% increase in e-bike fires, specifically linked to retrofitted, which is your kind of fixed style bicycle generally. And my understanding, I'm not an expert in TfL's rules and regulations, you maybe need to ask them, is that they have restrictions for the fixed type bicycles, whereas they may allow the foldable bikes, which, as Dan has alluded to, are built generally to a higher standard. So all we can do is advise them about the hazards and the risks, and the decision as to whether they consider further restrictions on their service would be down to them as an operator.
So somewhere in that, you think there is a risk. Do you think there is a risk based on the evidence that you've seen in terms of the rise of fires? Was it at the time of the review, or is that subsequent to the review?
Well,
is it a new risk?
The emerging, as I said earlier, it's been a 60% increase this year on the same period last year. So it's an emerging risk. So these are ongoing sort of dynamic discussions that we're having all the time with our partners, and I'm sure they're taking very seriously. I just can't answer on their behalf. I think Dan wants to come in there.
I'm going to bring you in, Dan. I just want to ask Stephen a question. You might want to follow up because of your earlier contribution that you made. So to Stephen, e-bikes are generally subject to better manufacturing, and batteries are positioned in a place where they're less likely to be damaged. Would you agree that e-bikes are less of a fire risk for those reasons?
Thanks very much for the invitation to come here today. We've done a deep dive sort of research into a broad range of issues around e-bikes and e-scooters and the emerging issue with the fires. And one thing we did look at as part of that research was the design of e-scooters and e-bikes. And they're quite varied, of course, and with an e-scooter, you'll often find the battery is at low level underneath the foot plate. You could argue that it could be prone to impacts from hitting curbs, going down potholes, that kind of thing. So as part of that report, we've made some recommendations on better designs to mitigate the risk of abuse to those batteries. So raising the battery up into a higher position. Many of the trial e-scooters now are adopting a higher battery position, maybe larger wheels to accommodate potholes, that kind of thing. So an e-bike, the battery is generally mounted a lot higher. It may be within the frame of the bike itself, so it's less prone to impact. But we've talked about why the risks associated with why is this phone not a problem in the same way as e-bikes and e-batteries. A lot of it's about the application, I think, because we've got lots of potholes. It's a bumpy ride most of the time, so that does have an impact. So we need to make sure that there is adequate ingress protection from water. You're going to be out all weathers, that kind of thing. You're not generally going to leave your phone out in the rain. So there's lots of different factors that you need to take into account when you start putting a lithium-ion battery into a mobile vehicle of that size. And I think another issue is that some mentioned like buses and why we're not concerned about the huge packs in those. I think the difference is the standards for a battery that's installed into a bus is vastly different to the standards that apply to e-bikes and e-scooters. They're very rigorous, robust. The technologies are far more advanced, required to be far more advanced. The BMS, we talked about, the battery management system, the quality of that has to be to a certain standard. I think what we're seeing in e-bikes and e-scooters now is a much cruder version of these protective systems, containment systems, that would ensure that if something did go wrong, then it's contained into small pockets rather than a huge battery. And we talk about this, the size of a battery inside a phone is maybe a third of one of the cells inside a battery that is installed into an e-bike or an e-scooter, and then you multiply that cell by 40, maybe 50. So we're looking at a large-scale situation where one cell goes into thermal runaway, you get thermal propagation to the other cells adjacent to that, and that's why you get literally a firework. It should be more of a pyrotechnic than a battery, I think.
Okay. And some of the gist is you're saying the next generation of these bikes are going to be better, less riskier. You can never eliminate the risk completely, but they're going to be slightly better because the positioning of batteries and the design overall.
Yeah, I mean,
from what we've learned.
There are standards that do exist for e-bikes and e-scooters in terms of the electrical systems and the mechanical design of the bike. But there are inconsistencies in those standards, which is something we're calling on government to review. So it's not a consistent approach to where the battery should be installed, where the motor should be, the ingress protection requirements, all that sort of thing. So that needs to be dealt with.
Now, Dan, in terms of your earlier contribution, and you wanted to come back on something earlier on, tell me from your viewpoint around some of those issues, around whether they are less of a fire risk.
I think it's we need more better definition of what you refer to as they and e-bikes. So I think the question that you asked earlier is almost impossible to ask unless you delineate between the good and the bad. I think you would get a very different question answered if you said, what's your opinion or suggestion on the bad electric bikes out there that are creating the problems, in which case I think unanimously around this table would be saying that that they are at fault and they need to be stopped, and how can we stop them? And we've already mentioned e-commerce platforms, third-party providers as one, and the gig economy as another point of potentially getting to these people that are using these and are maybe not receiving the same duty of care as their kind of pseudo-employer maybe should have towards them in the gig economy. So again, it comes to me down to the delineation between the good and the bad, and I think that's an important point to note here. I'm still hearing the term e-bike fires. The reason I brought this to the attention of the Bicycle Association about 18 months ago was for fear that we would move down this road where this sort of tar brush is applied to e-bikes in general. And as I've said previously, to my knowledge, there have been no issues relating to the good e-bikes. These all refer to the bad ones. And the advice and guidance which is given and can be misconstrued. And if I can give an example of that, the Fire Chief Council recommendations previously, there was some quite, and rightly so, strict statements regarding e-bikes and the potential risk associated with them. Although you have to scan further down onto the page to realise that it was the bad ones in that grouping. And what can happen is that insurers can take that information and the whisper that then goes to the estates managers and the likes is that if we use More London or the Canary Wharf estate as an example, there are blanket bans on e-bikes, period. And all that means is that our population are no longer able to cycle to work on their perfectly safe electric bicycle, which they've spent a lot of their hard-earned cash for, and it's the cheaper ones that have caused this problem. So again, I just want to emphasise the difference between the good and the bad, and how important that is to recognise.
And just as an observation on that, the more that you're prepared to pay and invest in these products, is usually you're going to get the better quality. Is that always the case, or are there, in terms of the development and the evolution of
unfortunately, it is somewhat factually correct, and there is a socio-economic issue associated with this also. It's very difficult to go out to a gig economy rider and say you must spend X number of hundreds or thousands of pounds on an electric bicycle so that you can go about your work. The reason that these guys and girls are choosing electric bikes, homemade kits, is that it's inexpensive for them to assemble and to put together, and they can deliver more in less time and generate more income for themselves, but they are putting themselves in danger by doing that. So I do think that the gig economy employers have a responsibility and duty of care over those individuals to ensure that they aren't necessarily condoning the usage of those badly assembled product. I would be looking to try to be contacting those employers as well as the auction websites as an area of targeting this issue.
Deputy Mayor wishes to come in.
Yes, thank you. So I think that it is right that there are e-bikes that could be described as good and those that could be described as bad, but it's very difficult for us to expect the public to be able to distinguish these on their own. And I think one of the issues is, from my perspective, is that government has not regulated as fast as this industry and these forms of transport have developed. So one of the things that I'm keen for, and that I know the Mayor supports, is around the urgent need for government to introduce a regulatory framework around the whole lithium-ion battery sphere. Because if they've got safety mechanisms, if they're well made, have safety mechanisms, they're I mean, I love my e-bike. I can't stress enough. They're an amazing opportunity for people to have active travel and sort of be part of that decarbonisation. So what hasn't happened though is that there is not enough regulation around this, and that I think is at the heart of the issue, is that more regulation is required. Now, everybody's sort of always reluctant to say let's have more regulations. This is a comparatively new form of transport still. We need to have regulations so that people can have the confidence that they know it's properly regulated, that they can distinguish through easy means who a good manufacturer, good sales person is. We shouldn't leave that entirely to the public to be able to use their own discretion. That is why they're backing off, is because they're unsure of where to go. So I think that the most important thing in this space is around regulation, so that we can allow people to have the confidence that they know what they're buying is safe.
Okay. Thank you for that. Lucy, can I come to you? I want to go to just the area of rental e-scooters. TfL said that they're too heavy to be carried, and so they are already prohibited under our conditions of carriage from being taken onto our network. Do you support the decision of TfL? And would you have concerns about the fire risk of your e-scooters if they were allowed on the TfL network?
Thank you. I don't have a concern about the fire risk of our equipment on the TfL network, but our bikes and scooters are not allowed on the TfL network. Most of the stations in London are geo-fenced, so you can't move a vehicle into the station in any case. We educate our riders not to take them on public transport. If they go on public transport, they can end up out of the business area, which we don't want either. So, yeah, I fully support that our vehicles do not go on public transport.
Okay, thank you for that. And then lastly, Chair, given the different reviews, and given the review, this is back to the LFB, given that the review was 2021, do we need TfL to review again in light of that earlier evidence, that emerging picture that you've said? Do you know what I mean? Should we have a bit more of a conversation and a new review particularly about e-bikes?
Thank you, Assembly Member. I think that review is constant. You know, our transport group are in liaison with TfL constantly. We update them with the latest fire statistics. So I think they are reviewing it constantly. It's feeding into their risk assessment. So I think that process is carrying on. We've got a good working relationship with Transport for London.
And just to be clear, if you were given the opportunity to present that emerging evidence again as you are in sharing, but in a more formal way, you'd probably be saying, because we haven't got that regulatory framework that the Deputy Mayor was referring to, that you'd be saying that you'd be supporting a ban of e-bikes on the network system.
Again, Assembly Member, I don't think it's for me to say that there's a ban on the transport system. I think we need to find a balance between, you know, sustainable transport and, you know, working with the safety on the transport system. What I would want them to do, and as I know they do, is take it seriously and feed it into their risk assessments on the evidence that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I'm wary that I might clash into Assembly Member Palancy's questions, so I'm going to be wary of that. Just to give you the heads up, Assembly Member Polanski. He earlier asked the Deputy Mayor whether they were consulted on the TfL decision to ban e-scooters on the network. I want to know whether experts in the industry, such as Dan Parsons from Fully Charged, was consulted at any point when TfL decided to do this ban. I know that you're specifically concerned about e-bikes, not e-scooters specifically, but I do want to know whether you've ever been consulted on these particular issues yourself.
I have not, no. And I'm not sure whether anybody else in the industry has. The question would be answered by the Bicycle Association, probably.
And is there a concern from your industry that there is a lack of consultation with the LFB or TfL when these decisions are being made? Are there conversations within your industry that you feel as if that you were talking about reputable companies like yourself that are have good quality bikes, that there is a need for more consultation?
Look, I think a continuation of conversation is incredibly important. An open dialogue between all stakeholders is necessary. With new and emerging risks, new and emerging technologies, I think technology tends to always outweigh legislation and our ability to kind of keep up with that. And it's a chicken and egg thing. You can't put rules necessarily into place for things that don't exist yet. The things need to exist before you can put the rules in place. And I think that's where we are in this situation. We as an industry, the cycling industry, play obviously slightly biased, but an important part of the role in the UK's transport infrastructure. And now transport has overtaken energy production as being the highest polluting sector in the UK's pollution statistics. It's more important than ever to ensure that our transport is decarbonised and as best as humanly possible. And we as an industry are working on doing that as best as possible. And there are the likes of the Bicycle Association, trade association, which is privately funded, to represent our voice and the voice of the retailers and suppliers. So there are people there to engage with, and I would strongly advocate a continuation of the conversation.
Thank you. And I do want to commend actually Dan Parsons' work. It was because of him that I pushed for the public awareness campaign back in January, and it's because of the work and the campaign.
I think we've lost Assemblymember Bakari.
I think it's probably just frozen, Chair, but we may need to just come back.
Yeah, we'll come back. Sorry, Stephen Kirtler, you had your hand up earlier. Is there a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to go back to the point about regulation. There are certain consumer products that require an independent assessment for safety, and due to the risk that they are considered to pose to the public. E-bikes and e-scooters, whether you see them come under electrical equipment safety regulations or machinery regulations, they only require the manufacturer to declare that the product is safe. There is no independent review of that. So I think that's worth taking into consideration. Maybe an independent third-party review or certification for particular product groups.
Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on a few threads. I think Dan spoke really powerfully about this being a social justice issue in terms of lots of people in the gig economy and maybe not being able to afford to go to a reputable dealer. And Deputy Commissioner, you talked about the data around people in bed sits. I used to be a property guardian before I was elected for about 10 years, and a lot of my housemates, at one point I was living with about 25 people, I'd say a good half of them were riding e-bikes and working for Deliveroo or Just Eat or other companies are available. And we used to worry about where things were stored and how they were stored in the building. Deputy Mayor, if there was more regulation, would you worry what this would mean for these people, and has any thought been looked into how you would reach out to them or support them?
I think that the support, I mean, this comes slightly outside my remit as Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. So I think that what I think I would want to see would be a really strong consultation by government that looks into the equality impacts of any regulation. So I think that before we saw that and before we saw what the government's going to consult on and what they come up with in regulations, I think that it's probably going a little further than I would be able to comment on at the moment. But I think that it's a really valid point. But I think that I would hope that when the government sort of carries out consultation, and I understand that they're already having quite a lot of discussions and groups and dialogue around what form a consultation might take and what it might look at, I think the thing to push for would be that it contained a proper equality impact assessment, and that consultation made sure that it reached out to as many groups as possible, and that's something we could sort of promote through City Hall, would be encouraging people who might be part of the gig economy to take part in a consultation.
Thank you. I totally accept it's not entirely in your brief. I just think if we're calling for regulation due to emerging fire risks, which is in your brief, we should always talk about just transition at the same time, and I totally hear that from you. Lucy, we've heard from Dan and Stephen around delineation and the difference between bad and good companies. In your opinion, is the TfL ban on e-scooters fair, and is it the right decision?
Do you mean TfL ban on e-scooters?
Yeah, and train networks.
Yes, personally, I do think that currently that they should not be allowed on there. But I agree with Dan. I think it's about good and bad batteries rather than the vehicles themselves. So a bad battery should not be allowed on the train. A good battery could be, in my opinion.
Thank you. And then Dan, today the Committee on Climate Change has released a report damning the government on all sorts of things, but one of the big sections is around active travel. And we also know when we look at the Mayor that we often talk backwards and forwards about an ambitious agenda to make sure there's segregated cycle lanes, that there's proper cycling instruction and all of that. If we ban e-bikes on TfL network, what would that mean for London cycling?
Interestingly, obviously it can't be overlooked that electric bicycles are, in theory, an alternative to public transport and should be reducing the weight on our networks rather than them, being used on the transport infrastructure at all times. For some of our customers, it might be the reason that they've jumped on a tube or jumped on a bus or other with their folding electric bicycle, the only ones allowed, is that they've got a puncture or the heavens have opened, and these are the people that are riding to work 5 days a week and have a little bit of respite on the TfL network. They have actively chosen to choose an alternative, more sustainable method of transport to commute to and from their place of work or for leisure purposes. And whilst I don't think that banning electric bikes is a good thing, I don't necessarily think it's the be-all and end-all.
Thank you. And Stephen, if I can turn finally really to a similar question to you, and are you concerned about a ban on e-bikes on TfL and what impact that might have on cycling?
I think it all comes down to risk management. It's not something that that you could probably generically enforce somewhere. It's down for each individual business to decide on whether they can manage that risk. And in case of a lot of the major operators, including the mainline trains, have decided that that's the best way to manage that risk is to create a ban. So we might find that will extend to other places. The first mile, last mile situation where someone takes a bike or a scooter onto a transport and then just needs to get to the office. Employers might start looking at the situation where you've got an e-bike or an e-scooter, potentially a converted one that doesn't look great. It's something that each business is going to have to make a decision on.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you. Moving on to look at car and bus risk mitigations. It's a question for Dom, I think. And you did kind of touch on some of these points in your discussions with Assembly Member Bailey. So has the LFB encountered any specific issues in relation to EV car fires? And if so, have you developed new guidance for firefighters on how to deal with these particular kinds of incidents?
I think the LFB has experienced what's acknowledged nationally and internationally is that they're challenging to extinguish, because we're very used to dealing with car fires, but once you've extinguished the car fire or the bus that's alight, you then have the challenge of the battery, and the challenge there is getting into that battery casing. We have aligned our policy as part of our National Operational Guidance Review recently last year, so all of our policy is up to date and in line with national operational guidance, and of course national operational guidance is linked into national and international learning on these subjects. So I think we're as good as we can be, and we are looking at the innovation on the market for different approaches to getting into the battery compartment and extinguishing the fires. Some of these more successful than others. What I am pleased to say, though, is the area that does look to be the most successful, which are high pressure lance systems with an aggregate that cuts through the battery casing and then allows you to put water at high pressure into the battery casing. We have those on the run in London Fire Brigade, whilst we monitor industry and see if they are indeed the best solution to deal with these challenges. But our crews are trained. They have had the training packages quite regularly, and we're just watching how the industry evolves to meet this ever-emerging risk.
Yes, I mean, you say ever-emerging. Are you seeing a significant increase in these kinds of incidents, or is it a steady increase? Or
not particularly. Steady increase, I would say, with electrical vehicle fires. But then I suppose my risk antenna is up to say, as they get older, will we see more fires with them as they get damaged and kind of tolerate driving conditions and potholes? It can be some of that mechanical damage that starts the chemical reaction and thermal runaway. So I think we anticipate it's going to be a hazard that increases for us as a fire service, and that's why we want to be at the innovative end of the kind of solutions that the market's presenting to extinguish those.
Thank you very much. And moving on to buses, what conversations are LFB and TfL holding on how to mitigate risks arising from the electrification of the bus fleet? And we saw, I think, just outside London, I would say Epsom or Esher, we saw electric bus fire in a garage. I'm sure these incidents are not isolated, but yes, Charlie.
Thank you. We're fortunate to have a dedicated transport team who focus on fire safety in that particular environment. And one thing we will do is work very closely with TfL and operators, so across a range of things. So that can start at the yard or depot, where effective signage that might have things about firefighting tactics, or it could be about environmental issues, because clearly, as colleagues have highlighted, the what comes next is important to us in terms of the impact on our communities. We'll talk about things like spacing. So if you park buses together tightly and they're of a certain technology, you can mitigate the risk by just moving them further apart. And then it's also, I think we have to be minded, as Dom said earlier, that the companies and their people are experts in a particular technology, so you'd expect to see things like isolation switches, safe charging, everything depending on the hybrid system. So we will look at it holistically and just try and feed into that, and then some of that transposes even onto our fire engines, where for a lot of EVs or electric vehicles we have a crash data system, for example, which will give our firefighters more information on where the hazards are, where the cut-offs are. So again, it's not a single piece, but it's good advice, for example, about spacing, good advice about charging and storage. So we try to do that across the board.
Okay, thank you. Because we've got lots of depots which are being, I guess, retrofitted to accommodate more electric buses. Do you proactively go out to operators? Do they come to you, or is it a mixture of both?
We'll always respond if there's an event or a fire, because the normal process would be to follow up, but we would much rather be proactive. And as I say, where we do have an advantage, although it's a small team, they will work across the transport networks to actually, I think, as the Deputy Mayor and Deputy Commissioner have said, to share the data we've got, share the experience, and it might be even something we've heard that's outside of London or even outside of the UK. But just talking about that, and then it comes down to, have they actually considered that in their fire risk assessment? Because we do have to come back to the point, it's for them to own their fire risk assessment, but for us to be serving our communities in the best way, we need to be giving them the best information and advice we can.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor, anything to add on any discussions you may have been having with TfL?
I haven't had specific discussions with TfL, but I have been briefed by the LFB on their wider discussions with Transport for London. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I wondered actually if I could come to Dan with a few follow-ups. Dan Daly, actually, I probably need to say, because there's more than one Dan. Good morning, Dan. To sort of get your view from the National Fire Chiefs Council. In particular, obviously, one of the issues that we've been touching on with parking of e-bikes and e-scooters is where people park them and how well they park them and how well they look after them. The same applies to, obviously, cars and buses, and obviously a lot of people do park in car parks, and I just wondered if you could run us through what the current requirements are for car parks to have automatic water suppression systems under current building regulations, and what changes, if any, the NFCC would like to see to those regulations. Because obviously, I can't be the only person who's parked up quite close to people who are charging their car actually in a car park in quite a constrained space. Not as constrained as a hallway, but it's, could still be dangerous.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of EV vehicles, the way they perform in a fire is different, but the output in terms of the energy and the heat isn't any different. But the fact that you've got vehicles parked close together, you can then get the combined effects of fire spread. And we've seen in car park fires, we've seen the devastating effects of the incident up in Liverpool a few years ago, where a significant fire with many challenges for the firefighters involved. I think we're still working with government on the building regulations, the revision of the approved documents, to try and improve not just the facilities for car parking, but also more widely accessibility for people to use buildings in terms of where you can safely store your personal vehicle, electric vehicle. Some years ago in a previous guise, we worked with housing providers around safe storage of mobility scooters, recognising the need for people to have those close at hand, but not ideally in their own flat block, in their own means of escape. So I think those are still very live conversations. More broadly, we've talked about the wider use of sprinklers in the built environment anyway as a really effective measure to raise the alarm and to tackle the fire at the earliest stage. And I think one of the things we have noticed with EV vehicles, certainly getting water onto the fire is a really effective way of stopping the spread as early as possible. But again, we do come back to this piece of education, really. We talked about the ban on TfL. You can understand why people take a really risk-averse approach when there's a lack of education around the issue, when there's an unregulated environment. that doesn't give confidence to people that are making those risk assessments. So I think more broadly what we're looking for here is the regulations to be in place to support decisions around how we design buildings and what we put into buildings to keep people safe. But certainly you wouldn't see us arguing against sprinklers used more broadly for a range of reasons way beyond just electric vehicles.
No, and clearly the Assembly has been calling for automatic fire suppression systems since the Larkanel house fire, and that's been some years ago now. So I think we're probably all together on the same page. But I think it was the Deputy Mayor who was saying that the technologies are moving faster than the regulations. So at the moment, it does still seem to be lagging. And to me, the car park situation actually is potentially worse than in the domestic place where you might have a single scooter or bike that explodes, because you might have an electric vehicle that explodes that happens to be right next to a bunch of vehicles that are full of petrol, which I think we'd all agree is an accelerant and is a fuel. So that could be a really bad mixture. So I can believe that the fire in Liverpool was particularly challenging to fight. Now I know that the NFCC has called for a review of building safety requirements for car parks to take account of all of these new products and the materials used in modern cars. Could you tell us about the products and materials in modern cars that you are particularly concerned about?
I think there's a range of materials that give off different gases and make the environment more challenging for firefighters. I think what we're more broadly seeing is that we as you said, regulations tend to play catch up to what is quite a dynamic environment and new ways of processing both vehicles, but also we see modern materials used in building design as well. So I think what we're trying to do is get ahead of that curve and try and push for the regulations to be much stronger, to ensure that whatever the materials used in cars or in the building environment generally, we're able to be ahead of that curve.
So where is the government then in terms of the review of the building safety requirements for car parks? Do you think we're at the point where they might make automatic fire suppression systems actually mandatory in that kind of environment?
I don't think we're at the place where that's going to be a decision made lightly or easily. There's an extensive amount of work going on in the review of ADB. It's well overdue, in fairness, and prompted by the tragic events of Grenville Tower, that we're now seeing that review take place. There's a number of research elements to that as well, to ensure that what regulations are put in place are effective and required, rather than just tweaking the wording within what is a complex set of documents that need to interrelate to the other approved documents as well across the built environment. So I think it's just one of those things that we'll keep working and pushing the key safety messages from a national perspective, working with colleagues both in LFB and other fire and rescue services around the country, using their evidence and experience to help inform the arguments that we will make.
I feel that the Deputy Mayor might want to come in on this matter as well, but I mean, perhaps I could ask both Dan, or maybe better to come to the Deputy Mayor, to say, if you were the Fire Committee and you were minded to make a recommendation to government about automated fire suppression systems, would you be focusing, for example, on car parks amongst the other areas that we've looked at? Is that something you think we should do?
So I think more research is needed. I think that we've got a problem at the moment where the government won't even mandate fire suppression systems in buildings where people are sleeping. So I think that, would I prioritise a car park where nobody is sleeping over a high-rise, over a school where you've got potential risks as well, including to the disruption to education? I think we've got a problem that the government is very reluctant to mandate fire suppression systems full stop. So I think that in the scheme of things, in an ideal world, would it be useful? Yes, probably. Are we going to get them from this government? No, at the risk of sounding a bit political, but I think that I'd be pushing first for some of the things that the committee and the Assembly's already been pushing on, which is having fire suppression systems where people are likely to be asleep. Obviously, we hope that wouldn't be in schools, but basically the school disruption piece is massive. So it beggars belief that we still haven't got a system in place where new schools are not getting fire suppression systems in as a sort of automatic thing.
Perhaps, it's the venues where people would have the most difficulty escaping from. So you included high-rise, obviously schools for that reason, because you're trying to evacuate a large number of people. But I think I'd probably add in care and nursing homes, just because the people themselves have got difficulties in exiting. And then car parks, I think I would want to see added, just because I think the nature of the fire that could result could be particular. For me, one of the issues is also, is it reasonable what we're actually asking the fire brigade to do and go into buildings where we've stuck flammable cladding all over the outside of them, in a high rise? No, and now we're taking it all off. And is it reasonable for us to ask people to go and try and put out a large conflagration that includes electric vehicles mixed with petrol or diesel vehicles?
I understand your point, but I think that the investment, and it would be an investment, needs to follow the highest risk. So I think that I'd want not that I think there's a hierarchy of where something terrible might happen, but quite clearly those care homes or those high-rise or potentially a school have a higher risk. So I think that rather than picking off which one is the most important one to have, a general push to have more fire suppression systems would be where I would go. In terms of fire safety plan guidance, I think just to note, and the committee may be aware already, that there was a consultation on the draft fire safety planning guidance last year, which officers are working through, and that is likely to there is a view that would include a section on cycle and EV parking. So I think the committee might like to sort of include that in their consideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I wondered if I could turn to the LFB on a slightly different area. TfL have confirmed to our office just last week that the only electric bus fire, which took place at the Potter's Bar bus garage in May 22, was as a result of human error. A conductive rather than non-conductive coolant was added to the battery pack. Can you confirm that this incident is definitely the only electric bus fire that has occurred since electric buses were introduced by TfL in December 2013? It's definitely the only one?
I would appreciate it if we can write back and confirm that, because the way you sometimes get data recorded, it might be a hybrid bus, for example, or it might be an electric vehicle where it might be a fire in the brakes. So we'll just need to check that detail if that's okay. But I think the information you've given does highlight the complexity and the technical detail in these things as well.
Thank you. Very happy for you to write back. You meet with TfL quarterly to discuss their fire safety programme and carry out a number of detailed inspection visits to TfL's premises so that you can have a look at how they're approaching fire safety. Have you identified any issues relating to the operation and storage of electric buses that they need to address? And if you have, what might those be?
So we haven't had a major issue identified with us, but to be fair, we find generally working with responsible stakeholders, they are responsible. So if we give advice around, for example, spacing, storage, signage, I'm certainly not aware of any issue we've had or pushback, because ultimately it's not good for the network if passengers don't feel safe or the public don't have confidence. So I think we've got a strong working relationship with TfL, and part of that is based on our practitioner level meetings as well as high level meetings where needed.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I think if customers thought buses were likely to catch fire at any odd moment, it would be a kind of a very quelling thing, and people wouldn't want to get on them at all. Just moving to a slightly different area, obviously these the lithium-ion batteries and the disposal of them, and people have done some odd things with them and just sort of thrown them into ordinary rubbish. We had a fire in Wandsworth, which my constituency in a recycling plant, which resulted from a lithium-ion battery being wrongly thrown away with lots of household waste. Do you think that most Londoners are aware of the risks that may result from inappropriate disposal of lithium-ion batteries? And what more can be done to get people to understand what they need to do?
I think it's fair to say more can be done, definitely, because many people have very busy lives, and it's just trying to think about those factors, end of life for product, being environmentally responsible and the hazards. So a wider level, I know that National Fire Chiefs Council, for example, have got a waste group that are looking at the issues particularly around waste sites, because that often impacts communities and the environment as well. Locally, I know that we always encourage consideration about disposal, responsible disposal, because ultimately if we can raise that through various forums, we'll talk about it, it's just about trying to reduce the fire as well.
So again, this might be something that we could usefully make some recommendations on in terms of raising public awareness. I can see that you're nodding. I wondered if I could come back to Dan Daly and whether you wanted to comment on those issues about disposal, but also whether or not the National Fire Chiefs Council is planning to engage with the DEFRA consultation on disposal and recycling of batteries, and what would you hope might come out of that in terms of further guidance to members of the public?
Just echo Charlie's points, really. We'd like to see responsible disposal. We do engage with the waste industry and have been quite successful in reducing the incidence of waste site fires over the years through that engagement. So I think it's a receptive audience and working with those, but I think that we've got to get back to the point at which these items are being thrown into general waste, and that's around public education, and the more partners that can speak up on that issue and help to spread that message, the better.
I think also having opportunities to dispose of them somewhere else. We were just talking about this before the meeting started, and saying that in some workplaces you can bring things in and dispose of it safely at work, but not all employers offer, or even shops. Actually, one of my local shops offers the opportunity for battery disposal, but it's not something commonly offered. Perhaps that's also something we could make a recommendation about, improving disposal opportunities, because I think people generally are, if you offer them an easy opportunity, it's a bit like putting dustbins along a road for rubbish. If there's no dustbins at all, people might throw it on the ground, but if there are bins, quite a lot of people will use the bin. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Can I suggest we have a short adjournment, a comfort break, and then we'll come back for the rest of the meeting. We'll be talking more about safety and advice. So it's 11:40 right now. Should I suggest we're back at 11:45? Okay. 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 Thank you all for that brief adjournment. I just want to come to Stephen Kirtlow, who had a few comments to make from earlier before we move on to Assemblymember Bailey.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to add to some very important points that have been made throughout the morning. As a consumer safety organisation, the consumer education and awareness raising runs at the core of what our activities are all about. So the Charge Safe campaign, we think, is an excellent initiative. And alongside, we've talked about online marketplaces and the problems associated with them. We have a long-standing campaign to try and introduce a regulatory environment for online marketplaces, because they're not actually considered to be an actor in the supply chain, so they don't take responsibility for the products that they sell via third-party sellers. And we've found a lot of examples of products related to e-bikes and e-scooters, namely conversion kits and chargers, that are clearly substandard, and they're obviously substandard because there's the imagery that you get on the posts make it fairly obvious that it's a non-compliant plug, that sort of thing. But we've worked with OPSS and we've worked with the online marketplaces, and hopefully the product safety review will see within that review some kind of regulation around online marketplaces taking more responsibility. So the fire statistics and information we have currently suggests that it seems to come from, the highest risk comes from conversion kits and the likes that you can purchase online. So that's a key area, I think, for us to focus on. There are no standards for a conversion kit either, so it's very difficult for enforcement authority to demonstrate that a conversion kit is non-compliant because there's no rule book to say what one should look like. So that's an important point. There's also the issue around chargers that are available online. We found many chargers that allow dangerous compatibility. When you look at the connections that scooters and bikes use to connect the charger to, they're very much universal. There's 2, 3 or 4 variations, but the problem with that is that chargers come at different voltages and batteries come at different voltages. So if you're left to your own devices or you get a replacement charger, you could fall in risk of purchasing a charger that's not compatible with the battery, and that's where you can get an overcharge situation on the bike. And that typically could well exist with conversion kits, where you're often left to purchase the charger and the battery separately from the conversion kit. So it's certainly a high risk environment with online purchases. So I say we're strongly campaigning to try and tidy that up and reduce the risk to consumers. The other point I wanted to make was about national fire data. It may be not as clear as we would like to the extent of the problem here, because the incident recording system that's used by first line responders to fires doesn't enable doesn't allow you to indicate that a fire source has been an e-bike or an e-scooter, so the system doesn't cater for that. So it's when you get the national fire statistics, you can't search for that to see UK-wide what the problem is. So we're reliant on the likes of the London Fire Brigade, who have fire investigation teams who take time to record that data in a lot more detail, and there's no requirement for other fire services to undertake that. So there is a strong reason for the incident reporting system to be able to accommodate that.
Okay, thank you very much. Assemblymember Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. My question on the DEFRA consultation has already been asked, but I'd be just to follow up, is there any kind of recycling standard for batteries? You know, do the major recyclers have a way that they're meant to recycle these, they're meant to take them in safely? Does that standard exist? By all means, Stephen.
Yeah, there is. The regulations require people who sell batteries to provide enter into a take-back scheme for people who need to recycle their batteries. It's more geared towards the likes of like the little AA's, AAA type batteries that you might see a drum or something in a superstore, and you can just pop your batteries in. I think with the situation with an e-bike or an e-scooter battery, you're looking more like a car battery size. So there are certain
Stephen,
schemes.
Sorry to interrupt, Stephen, but just could you move your microphone a bit nearer to you from the base? Just pull the whole base towards you.
I know that the Bike Association and the likes are looking at operating schemes using retailers to try and encourage recycling of batteries. Just to mention something that was previously mentioned about disposal, because of the size of the battery, people are probably less inclined to just chuck them into general waste. It's probably going to be more your disposable, single-use vapes, that kind of thing. But it is possible, so we're recommending that there's bolder, more prominent markings on batteries, and there could even be authorities that introduce curbside collections. So there's many solutions out there that may help with the disposal of those batteries.
I'll direct this question to the London Fire Brigade. Do we know how people are disposing of these batteries? Because these scooters and bikes are a fairly new phenomenon, and they're physically large batteries. What are people doing with them? Because I think they are ending up in the general waste.
I don't think we've got a high level of knowledge, because we do report regularly on fires involving waste and waste sites, for example, which is part of where we feed into Dan's organisational learning piece to try and make sure we make the best of the fire and rescue services. But certainly with e-bike disposal, battery disposal or e-scooter, we haven't seen much in the way of data. One thing we are trying to do is just finalise a thematic review of all the fires that we've seen relating to this type. And I must say it does include bicycles of all types and price points, although it's very much focused on things like conversion kits, for example. And we'll carry on doing that, because the more we can share that relevant data with stakeholders, the more that we can start influencing through having the starting point of that accurate data.
Because is there a risk that we have sort of a backlog where these devices are quite new, these batteries have a lifespan? We could be due a significant amount of these batteries now turning up in the waste just because their time is up. And if you look at the stats, the amount of fires happening in recycling in general rubbish is growing. This could be an underlying trend that could accelerate.
I think that's a very fair point, and I think the Deputy Mayor mentioned about the police look at how they dispose of things when, for example, they seize e-scooters, for example, or illegal products. It is a cross-sector, cross-organisation challenge, so I think you're right, but we need to be alive to it and looking ahead.
Okay. By all means, Dan.
Sorry, I just wanted to add a few things. So the WE regulations have been around for some time, which are regulations regarding the safe disposal of electronic equipment, including batteries, and they should be adhered to by responsible manufacturers, and manufacturers and suppliers do have a responsibility to either take back or put into place procedures where batteries can be taken back. I think an interesting point to note, and this doesn't of course happen with damaged batteries, is that most batteries, when they are at end of life, by nature don't pose that much of a risk, because they are end of life. The reason that we're seeing the fires that we see, especially during charging, is because the battery is charged, and it's that state when it's at its most unstable. When batteries reach their end of life, and it's like an empty fuel tank going to waste. It
has less potential. You're saying
it's a lesser potential. It's not completely gone, of course, but there's a far lower potential of there being an issue. Now, Fully Charged, my business, has been going since 2017. We've still got customers using their original batteries. So if you talk about risk growth or what have you, there is a growing amount of lithium-ion batteries which are in the network, which at some point in time will reach their end of life. That's indisputable. We do have customers that will replace them on a sort of a yearly or 2 yearly basis, especially on the commercial side, where they're being far greater usage and they wear out quicker. The better batteries are lasting longer. The challenge comes with the damaged ones and the safe disposal of those. And a point was made earlier about having supermarkets and other places being destinations for these batteries, and obviously high population density areas and the likes, I would be seriously concerned about sort of encouraging people, especially with the damaged batteries, to be bringing those to those kind of environments. That they need to be treated in a far different, far more careful way.
I suppose it goes to the education piece, because if you look at the people who are doing up-converting of some vehicle they've bought, that retailer online is providing no, correct me if I'm wrong, is providing no sort of place to give that battery back when it's finished, are they?
You're absolutely right, and it's these DIY kits which are proving the problem. And if we had the data, if we were to drill down into the detail of what the brigades are referring to as e-bike fires, I would bet a large amount of money, not a betting person, that they were the DIY kits that are most likely cause of those problems. And yeah, you are absolutely right.
Okay, thank you. Let me move on. I've got a question here, probably for Dan Daly and LFB and also the Deputy Mayor. The Mayor has said that retailers and the government need to do more to help manage the risk of fires from lithium-powered vehicles, e-bikes, etc. What could they be doing? What could each of those two different agencies be doing? Retailers and the government, that is.
So if I start, Assembly Member, thank you. We're working with the Bicycle Association to make sure that our message gets across to new e-bike owners so that they're aware of the hazards. And if you follow the Charge Safe campaign, it's got a bit there about recycling batteries and where to take them. But I agree, it's not as clear as it could be for members of the public how to recycle their batteries, which then, of course, introduce them into the waste chain and potential for further fires. So we are working with all key stakeholders trying to get the message across about how to safely live with and manage e-bike batteries.
Let me just quickly cut in. Dan, do you know of any e-bike retailer that gives a financial incentive to bring the battery back?
No, not yet, but I think I may implement that later today. That's a fantastic idea.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'll go to the Deputy Baroness. What could the government be doing more of to help these, mitigate the risks that we've been discussing all morning?
I think I've covered some of this already, but I think that the government, because this is a national issue, they really need to take a lead in sort of drawing together all the different voices in this area. And I think Zach mentioned sort of equalities issues, and you've got the retailers and manufacturers and the responsible manufacturers and retailers actually wanting to have a louder voice in this space as well. So I think as well as sort of the safety specialists, I think the government's got a role in sort of convening that and also sort of making sure that the regulatory framework that is required is sufficiently broad to deal with the whole range of issues and the emerging risks, because I think sometimes we look at the risk as it is today rather than what the risk is in a few years' time. So I think it's got to, if we get regulations in, they have to be ones that are sort of watertight enough to deal with the risks that we're seeing emerging now, but also sort of have that longevity. I think the idea of incentives to get people to bring back their battery bikes, their bike batteries, is a really good one, and I think it sort of ties into all that sort of circular sort of economy as well. So you're not sort of getting things that are disposable and just get disposed of inappropriately. So I think that there are all sorts of incentives that can be done, but I think government is that sort of authority that brings people together, and it's cross-governmental as well, and I know they're already doing work cross-government, so I think it's getting all those voices to make sure that the regulations we need are both done at pace, but also are the right ones and have that sort of longevity around them, and that people understand why they're there, because I think nobody wants unnecessary regulation, and that people then get the broader understanding in the public about how they distinguish between what Dan's sort of classified as good and bad, so that they actually sort of stop being afraid of entering into the sort of sphere of getting an electric bike or an electric car, and they sort of go, actually, I know it's likely to be as safe as possible because it meets this, this, and this, and this, and people get that broader understanding about it. So I think there's a lot that can be done. I think some of it's already in train, and we would be keen for government to work through it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Stephen, could I just quickly come to you? Do you think labelling is enough? Because a large part of this, to my mind, and I could be wrong, is about people not understanding. I don't think someone would put a battery in their bin if they thought it could set their own bin alight. You know, is the labelling enough? I buy radio-controlled car batteries all the time, and I noticed that the ones, I won't name the company, they come with a very prominent labels that says this must be disposed of properly, but it is the only brand that does that. So is there enough that the government are doing around labelling?
I think that there could be more prominent markings on batteries. Again, it's the reputable manufacturers who would make clear statements in bold writing, but a lot of the symbols are kind of unrecognisable sometimes. So you've got the wheelie bin, the crossed out wheelie bin. Does everybody understand what that is? Some of them you have a fire hazard symbol, but we're literally talking sometimes they're like 5 mil in sort of like size. So I think the more prominent markings that make sure that everybody understands it's a fire hazard and that you can't dispose of the general waste would go some way to improving the situation. And also there's other markings that would be useful as well, like the chemistry used. There's different types of lithium-ion chemistry. So in terms of recycling the raw materials, it would be far easier for a recycling plant to know how to recycle that if they know that the markings are there prominently enough to tell them what kind of chemistry it is.
Interesting. Dan?
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that, if you look at EN 15194, which is the electric bike safety standard, a large proportion of the first element of that is in labelling. There is a big number of pages and points where manufacturers, in theory, need to adhere to when they produce labelling and present labelling onto their product, and also into the supportive materials, both online and any sort of paper materials that kind of come with that. Again, it's the responsibility of the manufacturers, the reputable manufacturers, that it comes down to, and it's not always adhered to. I'd just like to point out as well, of course, that where that may be the case, there's the counterfeiting element that needs to be considered as well. So you may have seen previously the sort of CE certification, which has kind of been like the international gold standard for most consumer products, is very easily counterfeited, and you'll often see copies of that and the likes. We have our British standard diamond shield and the likes. And again, because of the self-certification element of this, where a manufacturer can put a product to market whilst adhering to all of the required legislation elements and conforming to all the safety standards, it not being ratified by a third party is a consideration. I would implore everybody to look at what's happening over in New York at the moment. I think there's been a mention of a devastating fire that happened, I believe it was last Tuesday, where a electric bike and electric scooter retailer went up in flames, and unfortunately there were some deaths associated with that. But the New York State have really accelerated their legislative efforts and presented a number of bills to their city policies. And one of those is the implementation of this UL standard, which is a private entity, which I believe that they're looking at potentially rolling out, whereby their batteries must be certified by an independent party. And again, are you going to expect the guard at the train station to be looking at the labels on there? Who knows that the labels that he or she are looking at are even legitimate? The challenge continues.
Yeah. With that in mind, Deputy Mayor, I fully accept the Mayor doesn't quite have the powers to do that. But is there more the Mayor could do around education, around even around the ask? I know as a committee we will make lots of recommendations. Is there something that the Mayor could do as well?
Yeah, so I think that when the government consultation comes out, I would anticipate us putting in quite a robust consultation response. So I think that would be the main issue, and I think that the Mayor's also been very supportive of the LFB's Charge Safe campaign, and continues to address some of the fire safety issues in the forthcoming London Fire Safety Plan guidance, which I've alluded to earlier. So I think that there's a range of things that the Mayor is already doing, and I think that sprinklers were referred to earlier, and that's also something that the Mayor's asked government to move forward with on a number of occasions. So I think in terms of that advocacy, the Mayor is doing a lot, but obviously there will be further opportunity in the future which we will pursue.
And just one tiny small question. It seems to me that the danger point is either disposal or charging, and when these batteries are charged, are we educating people? I know the programme is called Charge Safe, but are we talking about matching the right charger? Is there something we could do, Dan, to let people know you can't just plug any old charger into any old battery? I have batteries for my drone, batteries for my car, and they have completely different plugs, for instance. So you can't just plug anything to any charger. Is that a standard that we could be looking at as well?
Absolutely. I think the Charge Safe campaign and the points put out by both the National Fire Chiefs Council and London Fire Brigade are fantastic with that, and the recommendations to follow manufacturer's guidance, which always indicates only buying manufactured parts from the correct entity. So yeah, it's the problem again is with these DIY kits, and the fact that you can match up non-conforming product which doesn't necessarily talk correctly to each other, and that's the issue that we're at. But unfortunately, getting to talk to those people who may quite happily sort of flout the rules and regulations anyway in some instances, it's a real challenge.
Yeah, they're not. If you're flouting the rules, you don't want to hear about it. Dan, is there any way that we could have a sort of a, like with full size, real cars, we have charging standards, don't we? Have literally the plastic plug. Is there something the National Fire Chiefs could be saying about, a regulation that means that bikes would generally have a plug? Because even with these road makers, they would have to conform to that at least, as their product will be able to be charged publicly.
Yeah, I can see the point you're making, but I don't think it gets us around the sort of counterfeiting element. It doesn't get us around the second-hand marketplace and resale of damaged goods. I mean, your question originally was around what could more people do more generally, and I think whilst lots of people made views on that, I think one thing is that we're all in this, and there is a concerted effort. So Fire and Rescue Services do some really commendable work looking at people's own homes and do a person-centred risk assessment. So they look at where people are using this technology around their individual circumstances and provide advice to keep them safe. That's commendable and that's great. We could talk about government setting regulation. Regulation's fine, reputable companies probably don't need the regulation because they're trying to operate ethically and do those things, but the regulation will force out the rogue elements of that and maybe set some higher standards, and within that you could think about standards around charging, battery disposal initiatives being part of the regulations in order to be a recommended manufacturer. But even, I think it was mentioned earlier about the messages when yourselves are out in your communities, how do you take the messages back? Because the voice has to be uniform and has to be consistent across every interaction with members of the public. As with many fire safety issues, it comes down to preventative actions and awareness to try and stop the instance of fire in the first place. So I think that's more where I would drive at. We all have a role to play. Regulation, yes, but actually the education will drive out some of the poor performers and the poor behaviours that lead to some of the increased elements of risk in this area.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. And Assemblymember Bakari. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, Steve, sorry.
Right, no worries. Yeah, just to put on the point of the charging, to compound the issue, if you've got a laptop that's rated at 18.5 volts or something, you buy a charger that's rated at 18.5 volts, and probably similar with your drone as well. I've got one of those, they're good, aren't they? But with an e-bike scooter, for some unknown reason, the battery rating will be like 36 volts. The charger you need to purchase is 42 volts. So it doesn't work in your sort of intuitively which charger you need to purchase. So something needs to be done with that. But you mentioned about the standards for charging arrangements. There is a technical specification which has been produced by the committee that has published the e-bike and e-bike standard to try and tackle with this developing problem. And the committees often publish a technical specification because they haven't got time for it to go through the formal process of becoming a designated standard or an actual standard. So there is one in place that we mentioned in our report, and our recommendation is that is accelerated and becomes a designated standard so that manufacturers can cite that and use that for proprietary, non-proprietary charging systems. Proprietary means the manufacturer's built this connector so that it only fits that battery. You can't go off and buy some different charger unless you start cutting the connectors off. And non-proprietary just uses technology that signals to make sure that the voltages and the current are correct, so you can move more generic connectors, but there are protocols and safeguards in place, and that standard deals with that. So that's one of our recommendations.
Okay.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. Stephen, if there is anything more that you want to add on regulation, please do, because I'm coming from a place of frustration when it comes to this issue. I've written joint letters with MPs on the need for regulation, like I said, since January 2022. So why do you think there is such a slow progress when it comes to the government to take action from your perspective?
I think it's difficult with an emerging sort of issue to react, and things always take time, I guess, as well. Partly the problem is that there is inconsistency in the standards, there's gaps in the standards, and one of the recommendations we're asking for is for OPSS, perhaps UK government, to undertake a review of those standards, because then they can be referred to within legislation to set the benchmark and a level playing field for reputable retailers who are trying to sell product that's compliant and safe. So there isn't a silver bullet solution to the problem. We need to look at various angles. It's not just legislation, it's standards as well, and it's education to the consumer. So I think it's looking at it holistically in that sense rather than just looking at regulation. But hopefully the product safety review will create a framework which will allow us to change where we need the regulation for certain products that we believe or understand to believe after a period of time are of increased risk. There's a new regulation in Europe. It's the General Product Safety Regulation. It's just been implemented, and it introduces facilities such as implementing acts, so that the European Commission or various member states can implement certain requirements on certain product groups, and that may be a route that the UK government want to go down.
Thank you. And can I just go to the Deputy Mayor quickly on this, because my recent oral question to the Mayor, and as you know, I've been relentless on this issue, was to ask him what he had done in terms of his work on lobbying the government. He said that he had written to Chris Philip, the Minister of State, on the issue, but can you get me in any updates on his communications with the Minister on this?
I don't think the Minister's responded yet, but I have asked, as part of the correspondence from the Mayor, to meet Chris Philp, and I'm hoping to do so, not just about this, but obviously about other issues around the fire sector and some of the issues around culture. So I think I'd be very keen to do that. I think, though, that this isn't just something that Chris Philp, as Minister for State for Police and Fire, can solve on his own, and it's that cross-governmental action and coordination that is really required to make sure not just that people are aware of and can respond to fires of this nature, but that the whole range of fires in this lithium-ion fire space, including obviously sort of you get dodgy electric sort of lithium-ion batteries for power tools and so forth. So this is where I'm going with. We have to make sure that the regulations don't just home in on one thing and then we sort of find there's a gap somewhere else. They have to sort of cover the whole remit. So I think that it's that cross-governmental piece that will really matter. Thank you.
And to the Deputy Commissioner, could you also give me an update on, you've also been having recent meetings with the Minister of State. What's the latest?
Yes, thank you. Our Commissioner wrote to the Minister on the 27th of March. We then saw him at an all-party parliamentary group for fire and rescue on the 6th of June at Westminster, where we raised these issues again, and his office facilitated a meeting which we had with all key stakeholders on the 13th of June, which was with the Home Office, OPSS, the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, and we had a roundtable discussion about our concerns and the actions being taken across government to address them. Home Office took an action to coordinate all of that and come back to a further roundtable in about a month's time, so we can check on the progress being made and check if we're satisfied with that progress. So I think that was a positive start, but much more that needs to be done, and we will be staying on that front foot and trying to influence where we can.
I mean, are you talking about progress? Are you have the government been asking you for any specific evidence to help them in their regulation, need for the regulation and speeding up in this process?
Thank you. I'll let Charlie come in for that one. Thank you.
Yeah, pardon me. In terms of the regulator for the actual product safety, that's the Office of Product Safety and Standards. We are continuously providing data and sharing lab examination info on a regular basis. So we have a quarterly catch-up as well to look at trends. One of the challenges with these kinds of fires is because, as Dom referenced the video that we put online where somebody had a very near miss in the communal area of their building when their e-bike caught fire. Such fires are really intense, so it can be very hard to get good data from that. So we're also reliant on things like product traceability. Where did the product come from? Because that speaks to, is it counterfeit or not? So, but to get back to point, yes, we are continuously sharing our data with the OPSS.
Can I ask you both as well about the Charge Safe campaign? You know, obviously I'm incredibly pleased that this is happening, but how are you assessing its success? And I'm wary of this question because, and it's an incredibly difficult one. You know, we don't want to have anyone die from a fire. So what do you do to assess the success? Is it number of fires, injuries, or is it more complicated than that?
Thank you. I think as the media campaign still rolls out, we're assessing it as we go. I mean, obviously, there's the metrics about how many hits we're getting and how widely it's been shared, and I think we're really pleased with the take-up and the media attention it's had. Maybe as some measure of success, you know, when you look at London in comparison with New York, as I said in my opening piece, they've had 13 fatalities so far this year, and I know they've been working really hard to publicise the hazards with e-bikes. But I think, you know, we've had the tragic example of Sophia back in January, but whether by luck or by campaigning and our strong message on prevention and protection, we haven't had the same extent of fire death or injury that New York seemed to be experiencing. But I think we could probably get back to you with how we're going to measure it tangibly and see if it's been as successful as it could have been. Yeah, Charlie, please.
If I can just add to that, I think a common piece today has been about everyone being involved. So while it's not necessarily the best metric, we can look at conversation with Uber, for example, and their work to amplify our message. We can look at our borough risk management plans and seeing how our borough commanders are actually getting those posters and that awareness up in our communities. Because we have to look at the significant increase in rates of ownership will obviously have a factor on how many fires we see. But I think while it's hard to measure, I think the more we see our work with partners and stakeholders, I think while it's not necessarily a numbers thing, we can actually take heart that at a local level our borough risk management plans are making a difference.
My only concern is that, it has taken a while for the campaign to have started. You know, I mean, like I said, I'd raised this a year before our first tragic death. And I don't think it's, it's really difficult for me to say this, actually, but I feel as if we wait for data, and this is not just in terms of policy to do with fire, it's all sorts of issues I've been dealing with as a councillor when it comes to safety on our roads. Why is it that we have to wait for something so tragic before we have an escalation of any progress or change in campaigns like Charge Safe from happening? Do you think that there might be a reassessment from even the LFB's perspective on when it comes to doing public awareness campaigns, not to wait, but actually to go ahead even when there is just even a hint of rising data? It's a complicated and difficult question, but I think it needs to be asked.
It is. I think there needs to be an element of data to drive campaigns, of course. But just to reassure you, Assembly Member, of course, we were acting on this many years ago when we first saw the first signs with the scooter fire on the underground at Parsons Green. So I hope that's some reassurance that we certainly haven't sat on our hands, and where we've seen the risk, we've proactively engaged with partners to manage and mitigate that risk.
Okay, I'll come back later with some more questions. I think we have another Assembly Member ready.
Thank you for that, Assembly Member Carr. Just to remind colleagues, if we could pick up the pace of our questioning a bit, I think it would be helpful. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Mayor, can I ask you about high-rise residential buildings? For obvious reasons, fire is a huge worry in these buildings. Does there need to be more guidance around safe cycle storage, particularly in high-rise buildings?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so in high-rise buildings, does there need to be more guidance around safe cycle storage?
I think that as part of the work of the responsible persons awareness raising with residents, then I think that it's something that the LFB would be working on through the borough risk management plans to make sure that people are raising that as an issue. I'd go back though to the lack of regulation and the lack of clear guidance that is required, because for all the manufacturers' leaflets that might come with this equipment, with the best will in the world, not everybody's going to read it. So I think that the tighter the regulations and the more sound they can be in terms of how the whole area around it and the arena around it is is structured in terms of regulation, the better. I wouldn't want people in high rise to think that they are excluded from owning these electric bikes in the future, but quite clearly they do need to be aware of that exit route. But that is the same for whether they've got buggies and normal bikes that might be blocking an exit route as well. So I think that whole sort of how would you get out of a building is the most important aspect that people can discuss potentially. But I'll hand over to Charlie, who's nodding and probably has much more detailed information on this than me.
Could I add a slight thought to it, Charlie, as well, and then maybe you can build on the Deputy Mayor's answer. My anecdotal evidence of cycling storage, particularly in these buildings, is it's often vertical, and we're talking about the problems of impact of batteries hitting the ground. Does there need to be a planning consideration when designing recycle storage in these buildings?
So I think we saw several years ago, well, decades ago, we saw the loss of pram sheds, which led to issues in communal areas. So it is an ongoing piece in terms of planning and design, particularly around accessibility and equality. So I think that we continue to work on that. From our perspective, we've got guidance note for communal areas, which is specifically around blocks of flats and high-rise areas. And we're just trying to finalise some additional guidance that will cover all buildings for responsible people. But when we think about the diversity of the high-rise estate in the capital, there is very different situations and there could be very different solutions. And I certainly think part of the conversation with the electric scooters and e-bikes is just what can we do to mitigate, be that in transport, be it on the home. So it's not always as binary as do we have them, do we not have them, but how can we live and manage with the risk in a proportionate way. So as I say, this guidance we're putting out will hopefully be ready very shortly. We already have the fires in communal areas. And our fire engineers, when there's a refurbishment or a new build, we will give additional guidance accordingly where we can.
Thank you. As a supplementary to that as well, I've seen examples of housing associations or landlords labelling things in car parks saying, you know, this is a fire risk, this isn't a fire risk. Sometimes incidentally it's plants, which I think is a whole other conversation about climate resilience, that sometimes people are presumably planting things because of fear of risk and the need for more sustainable urban drainage. But people don't often label the cars as a fire risk. It's often that they're missed because they're meant to be in the car park, in inverted commas. Again, do you think, is this something your guidance is going to be looking at?
In terms of cars and car parking, I think that's already been covered earlier on, but we are, again, on a day-to-day basis, our fire engineers are giving additional guidance, particularly around fire suppression, ventilation, isolation cut-off points, so when we get there, and also consideration if there was a fire, how do you actually remove a vehicle from that situation? So we are trying to be proactive, but I think, as has been said earlier, it is a societal issue that we have to continuously work with and work on.
Thank you. And finally, Dan, I think this is other Dan this time. This is a national issue, clearly. Is there more guidance that you think needs to come?
So I think what Charlie said has pretty much covered the issue. For me, it's still very much about education with individuals, because as much as we can regulate the common areas of a building, the way access to buildings provided for all sorts of people, whether you be a wheelchair user, a cyclist that uses a small vehicle electric vehicle to commute. We need to make sure that the buildings are accessible for those people, but what happens inside people's own homes is a different area. So once you go behind that closed door, what do people do on their escape routes from their homes? And that's about education. And it does come back to making sure we've got really good products available to people in the first place. And that may be through regulation, but it's also through the R&D and the efforts of ethical and responsible providers.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I just want to remind colleagues again, so I'd really like to have the full 20 minutes for the final section on disposable barbecues, so I think it's really important. So if we could just wrap up this section in a timely manner. Assemblymember Bakari.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Deputy Mayor, there have been lots of discussion about the government's position on this, but as you know, we need to hold the mayor to account as well, and on what he's doing to prevent the rising number of lithium-ion batteries across the capital. We've talked about lobbying the government. I've also raised with him doing something like a kite mark as well, where there could be a way of saying that this is a reputable company. But I know that there are issues on that. I understand that. But here's another idea, and I'm going to just moot this with you right now. The Charge Safe campaign is a great campaign. It's something that is so vital, and we need to promote this as much as possible. How more can the mayor promote the Charge Safe campaign? Is there a way of perhaps using the Charge Safe campaign to combine it with companies that are reputable? So, for example, Dan Parsons' company, it promotes Charge Safe within his company and has a kite mark or a label or a sticker outside his premises to say that they support LFB's campaign to charge safely. Is there anything more that the mayor can do, something similar in that kind of line?
But I think that, without wanting to push back on that as a good idea, I think that's already what the LFB is doing in terms of their promoting their campaign. The mayor is promoting the Charge Safe campaign, and I think that that's a really vital thing that the mayor is doing. And I think that the mayor's been very strong on this and very supportive of the LFB's Charge Safe campaign, including, as I understand it, on social media. So I think that the addressing the fire safety issues through the London Fire Safety Plan guidance, which I've already mentioned, is clearly one thing. If the LFB's engagement with retailers and food delivery companies doesn't produce the desired outcome, then I would support the mayor in adding further pressure to these organisations to take the appropriate action. What I don't think the mayor needs to do is, when the LFB is sort of leading a campaign as a fire and rescue service, I don't think the mayor necessarily needs to step in and own it when the LFB is already going ahead with it. I mean, not that I'm underestimating the additional power that would bring, but I think there's a value to waiting and seeing how the LFB get on as a very trusted organisation in this space, because they are responding on a daily basis or almost daily basis to fires of this nature. In terms of the kite mark, I don't think we should have London-specific kite marks. I think that what we've heard from the expert panel today is that there's already confusion about different types of markings on batteries. So I think, at the risk of repeating myself, I think we need a regulatory framework that is effective and is understood both by retailers, manufacturers and the public, and that will make a massive step in the right direction. What I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, whether that's the mayor doing a slightly different campaign on a campaign that we actually just want to make sure that people understand the Charge Safe message, which isn't that you shouldn't be charging things or you shouldn't be having electric vehicles or electric bicycles or electric tools in your house, but that you need to understand how to use the new technology that can make a massive difference to our lives and to decarbonisation, but it needs to be done safely. So I think all credit to the LFB for chipping away at this over many years, and I think that the more that the Assembly can do to get behind the LFB's campaign, the better, and I'd urge that to be one of the recommendations. Without wanting to write your report, I think the more that the committee can do, and you're clearly incredibly interested in this topic, the more you can do to support the LFB's campaign, the better. And I know the mayor would welcome that as a big supporter of this campaign.
Thank you. I mean, I agree that the LFB is doing a fantastic job, and I've said that before. My only concern is that, and you mentioned this as well, Deputy Mayor, that not everybody reads the website, not everybody is aware of it, and we have got an issue where just not enough people understand and realise the risks. So there is an issue, and there is something that we could do more on, and I am hoping that the Mayor could, if not do more to support the Charge Safe campaign. I know that he's very supportive, but there has to be something else that we can do just to get that message out better than we are at the moment. Dan from Fully Charged, also, do you have anything to add in terms of what the Mayor could be doing in this particular area?
I think it's a very difficult topic, and I think that's why we're all sat here today. I think from my point of view, it's just that clear delineation between good and bad. You know, if I'm allowed to mention a brand name in Bosch, you know, a lot of your kitchens will have Bosch equipment in, the underbellies of cars will be Bosch. They are one of the biggest, if not the biggest player in the electric bike industry. I have quizzed them. They are not aware of a single issue, fire-relation issue, to a non-damaged battery being properly used in their network, and they put roughly 1 million of these things into the marketplace on an annual basis. It's an enormous thing. This almost certainly is down to the DIY bad equipment being purchased cheaply online and condoned. Its use is condoned by the likes of the gig economy. If I can have anything heard from today, that's I guess what I'd like to hear and be noted. The clear delineation between good and bad, and if we can do whatever we can to ensure that the press and other understand and appreciate that, then I think that's incredibly important. Otherwise, what we're going to do is quash a potentially critical part of our more sustainable transport solution before it's even got off the ground.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to do this online. I really appreciate that. I'm going to have to go now.
Have a very happy Eid.
Okay. Eid Mubarak, everyone.
And now moving on to disposable barbecues, so the final section. Assemblymember Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to start off by asking more broadly just for some stats and evidence from the LFB, please. So I'll start with yourself, Dom, and Charlie. Can you tell us how many fires have been caused in London so far this year because of disposable barbecues?
Thank you. The numbers are relatively low in terms of confirmed, so we have 2 recorded, but that really doesn't reflect the issue. We spent a huge amount of time with our fire investigators, are very highly trained, and also working with police colleagues following the devastating fires last year. And the thing we find is when you're looking at a scene of many hectares, it is really hard to determine that it is definitely a barbecue versus careless disposal or even fire setting. But having said that, we do know that because they have hot coals, they can start fires. So what we have to do is take the position of, if we know this can affect our open spaces, our environment and our communities, we have to think, what can we sensibly do to reduce it? So I think in this case, while the numbers of confirmed incidents are very low, I know I myself have walked through devastating fire scenes and you see the remains, the foil trays. So I think, how can we not do the responsible thing in that case?
Thank you. I mean, I think it was last year or the year before the London Fire Commission actually called for a ban on disposable barbecues. So do feel free to elaborate a little bit more about why you think that's something the Mayor and the Assembly and the government should be considering.
I think what we've worked with is to encourage retailers to consider withdrawing them from sale during periods of hot weather, but probably more importantly is a ban in parks, in open spaces, and then that's policed. I think that's the thing that has real benefit as we enter the kind of extreme weather periods. That's the key thing. And then where we're really adding value here, I think, is in our local borough risk management planning processes. So if you were to look at Borough Commander Richard Arnold in Newham, and if you look at his local borough risk management plan, he has regular meetings with the local authorities that are responsible for open spaces and the park keepers to make sure that they're keeping on top of the undergrowth and that kind of urban-rural interface and managing the appropriate fire breaks so that we're in a better position should we have, you know, the same kind of hot summer this year that we had last year. So I think that's the key area that we really want to emphasise. And we've written to all local authorities to ask them to implement bans in their open parks and open spaces when it comes to disposable barbecues.
What's the response from local authorities been like on that?
Really good generally, and again that's reflected through the local borough risk management planning processes. The response is good. I think nobody could fail to acknowledge the extent of the wildfires that you know took us all a bit by surprise. I think last year to see that kind of risk you know come to London, I think was sobering and a kind of step change in how seriously we need to take these environmental hazards. So I don't think we've had to push too hard for local authorities to realise they need to manage their open spaces, local authorities and other landowners really. And the key to that is the local borough risk management plans, because our boroughs and our stations know their patch, they know where the fires start, they know where the pinch points are, and they can get out there and influence and find the responsible people. And then if they can't find the responsible people, of course they can escalate that through the local authorities. And I think that's where we're hopefully going to have the biggest bang for our buck this year, and hopefully have a different outcome this year than we had last year.
Thank you. I mean, obviously you would hope that in instances where an instant barbecue has led to a fire, it's maybe due to carelessness rather than intentional damage. So to that end, I wanted to sort of just ask you a little bit more about your work with retailers to promote safer alternatives to disposable barbecues, because obviously there is an issue about who has access to their own private green space or the ability to have their own barbecue. So I think a big part of this work also to bring Londoners on this journey with you is about promoting safer alternatives so they still feel like that's something that they can access. And I know that Deputy Mayor might want to come in on this one.
Sorry, if I just start, we are aware and we've worked with local authorities who have actually put barbecue areas in open lands themselves on concrete plinths that are actually very, very much reduce the risk and encourage people to get out in the open environment. So I think, again, it's that across the board effort to do so and get people to be responsible. And of course our concern is not just in the open spaces, but people using barbecues on balconies, for example, as well, which is the other element of our messaging, is just thinking about that responsibility. And it comes down to that education piece as well of, you know, let's start with our own behaviours in our community, let's think about our environment, and then work with British Retail Consortium, who we met with. Again, we were just trying to encourage them to influence their members as well, just to think about that and responsibility, because while it's difficult to give hard data, it's far easier to leave behind a small foil tray that's hot and hard to pick up rather than if you've invested in a proper barbecue.
Absolutely. Deputy Mayor.
Yes, so I think we have to be proportionate about this, but we also have to recognise that actually things like barbecues on balconies have caused really quite serious fires. So a few years ago we saw an award-winning development in Barking Riverside go up in, pretty much practically destroyed because of a barbecue that had sparks on the balcony. And then more recently there was a fire in Croydon that was caused by a barbecue on a balcony. So I think that while we should have a built environment where people live that reflects what people want to do, which is have a barbecue in the summer, much more sensible to have communal barbecue spaces that are properly monitored and looked after than say, well, it's everybody's human right to have a barbecue on a balcony. It isn't actually. It's regrettable that some people can't have a barbecue where they want to, but that doesn't mean that we should say that's what we need to do. We need to make sure people have access to outside space where they can safely have the type of summer activity they want, and it is possible. What isn't possible is when it's as hot as it was last summer, we actually have to ask people to behave differently, and that's where those discussions that the LFB regularly has and that the LRF has had around sort of how can you prevent fires and how can you prevent the grass fires and the wildfires that we saw last summer. Part of that would be asking people not to have barbecues. and having seen the sort of devastation of the wildfires last year, I'd say it's very tempting to say we should ban them outright, but actually it's about behaviour change and people actually learning how they have to live as responsible citizens in a changing environment, and that involves messaging. It involves saying this week or today, please avoid having a barbecue, but it also involves sort of how we can sort of look at the circular economy and sort of disposable barbecues they're not recyclable, they're disposable, they're not part of that sort of environmental approach. We'd want to have a circular economy in the future anyway. So I think that the Mayor and I would support LFB's call to Londoners to act responsibly and refrain from using disposable barbecues during periods of extremely hot weather. The guidance that's being given to retailers is really helpful in terms of limiting their sale. I think it's really welcome that the British Retail Consortium has produced voluntary guidance on this. And I think that it is only part of the problem. It's the same as with the e-bikes. You can home in on one aspect of a problem. Disposable barbecues aren't the only reason that we get grass fires and wildfires in the summer. So Shirley Rodriguez and I met Keep Britain Tidy to discuss how the Mayor continue to support their important work. Rubbish and flammable rubbish can cause wildfires. A broken glass in a park is probably it's probably as much of a concern to the LFB as a disposable barbecue might be. A cigarette or a sort of vape that's disposed of irresponsibly could cause as much of an issue. And the Deputy Assistant Commissioner referred to the fact that some of these fires we think are set deliberately. So there's a whole range of reasons why we need to be cautious in the summer. Disposable barbecues are a part of that, but they're not the whole thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I totally agree with you about it. It's that balance, isn't it? I think behavioural change, particularly when it comes to perhaps barbecues on balconies, which sounds really dangerous, but also ensuring that councils are encouraged to provide the infrastructure that gives people the alternatives who maybe don't have access to their own green space or even balconies for that matter. There's a question here on what has the Mayor done to pressure the government to introduce a ban on the sale of disposable barbecues and their use in open spaces. And then I want to rapidly pass over to Assemblymember Best, who hasn't had a chance to come in yet and wants to speak on this as well.
So the Mayor responded to the government's resources and waste strategy consultation and called for the deposit return scheme to include the widest possible array of materials. That's one thing. Particularly keen to work to transition London to a circular economy model. So this would mean that the Mayor is directly opposed to any single-use disposable items, which would include disposable barbecues. He did support the London Fire Commissioner's call for a ban on disposable barbecues and action on cigarette littering, particularly in the wake of the wildfire last year. And I think it'd be worth the committee talking to Keep Britain Tidy because they've got some interesting research into disposable barbecues. But I think it's going back to the point, we need to look at this issue in the whole, not just home in on one sort of headline grabbing issue. Otherwise, we sort of home in on one thing and say, well, this has to be banned, but sort of ignore the fact that there's a whole range of other ways that wildfires and grass fires can be caused in the summer.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Chair, I'll hand over to Assemblymember Best, if that's all right with you.
Thanks, Assemblymember Best. Thanks. And Deputy Mayor, I'd kind of like to keep on going on that same train of thought, if that's okay. So, do you know how many public spaces there are in London for people to safely barbecue? Just the mic.
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Do you think that information would be something that could be helpful in directing people to the places where they should go to have barbecues?
I think it would be useful if there were sufficient places available. I think that part of that discussion that the Fire Brigade is having with boroughs in connection with the borough risk management plan would be about that. I suspect that there's not enough places currently and it's something that we would encourage councils to consider looking at what is available. But obviously not all the open space would be owned by councils either. So I think I would think that would be a useful thing to develop, but I think we'd need to be clear that there were sufficient numbers of places to drive the public towards. Otherwise, I think there might be issues over particular sites. And I know that there's some areas where boroughs have actually reduced the numbers rather as a sort of reaction rather than increase the numbers. And it's about that sort of careful management and making sure that everything's proportionate and encourages people to have safe leisure activities. But I think that if you drive it away completely in terms of that safe environment, you end up with people doing it off their own backs anyway, and it's sort of potentially causing problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking, you know, the time it's taken to write out that to those boroughs, like the cost of bans and putting up signs, the cost of, you know, be it the Met or be it the park officers that are going and having to police on this. There seems a much nicer way to go about it with the carrot as opposed to the stick. And my concern is that you're saying this is something to push on to councils, but I think this is some regional work really, where if you took this work on and made it clear where can I have a safe barbecue in London, that would really help people, because let's be frank about who this affects. You know, some people have gardens and have the ability to do that. Other families and young people in particular don't have those same sorts of facilities, so they're going to be prohibited from things that other people can enjoy. And there's an easy way, I think, regionally we can address this by letting people know where those safe spaces are. So could you please look into that? And I think hopefully it's something that's drawn out of the report.
Yeah, yes.
But can I say one other thing as well, just to speed it up? It's just so would you take on that point that could be some regional work that we could advertise that, but also look at what money or grants the mayor could use to plug those gaps and look at where we can create safe spaces, because that preventative measure is going to save money to the GLA group, be it the Fire Brigade or be it the Met.
Yeah, so I will take it away. The one point and apologies for interrupting you, that I was trying to make is that climate change means that there will be some points in the year, pretty much every year from now on, where we would need those signs going up in parks, and we would need people to take extreme caution, both in parks and, to be honest, in their own gardens, in terms of safe barbecuing. So that's one thing. The rest of the summer, hopefully people would be able to do that. But where the GLA is not responsible for the maintenance of a park or open space, I would be extremely reluctant to commit for me to go away and say we'll go and do a scheme. I think it's a really attractive idea, but I think unless we can be 100% confident that that place is properly maintained, there's a risk associated with that. So I'm not saying that it's not a sensible idea, but if a park or a barbecue area in a housing estate is not maintained properly, then there's a risk associated with us sort of promoting it as a safe place to sort of send people to do that. What I will do is go and try and establish, which my colleagues might have some funding somewhere that could help what you are rightly thinking would be a good thing to achieve. And I'll write back to the committee chair to say how far I've got on in those conversations. I think it's a really attractive idea, but what I don't want to do is commit to it on the hoof in this meeting.
I appreciate that, thank you. And this is to the London Fire Brigade, please. So you've got a leaflet on barbecue safety which was produced in May 2019. Do you plan to update your guidance to the public this year to highlight the increased risk of using disposable barbecues?
Yes, we do. Thank you for raising that. Yes, we do. Although much of the messaging is still current, but we will be updating it. Thank you.
Do you know when you'll be updating it? Because obviously it's June, almost July.
We're looking at it now, so we'll be looking at updating it now.
So we can expect that new leaflet?
Yes.
Will it be out next month?
It will be out as soon as it can be out. So we're updating it. like I said, a lot of the information is still the same, but you're right to raise it that it's the 2019 version. So we'll be updating it and getting it out as soon as possible. But I can write to you and let you know when we plan to do that.
Okay, summer is very soon, so.
Yeah, but
Thanks.
Noted. Thank you.
Assemblymember Polensky, 30
super
seconds.
quick, 20 seconds.
No speeches.
Deputy Mayor, the Mayor said that he would look overseas to some examples of best practice. He said, let's not reinvent the wheel. Have you got any tangible examples of any conversations you've had or he's had?
Well, I've spoken to the... so Shirley Rodriguez and I met the Mayor of... Sorry, it's been quite a long meeting. We met one of the American mayors about what they're doing, and I think that it's really important that we learn from cities overseas where you've got that urban interface with wildfire. So I think those conversations are really important. I've also spoken with the Fire Commissioner, who's had detailed conversations with people in Australia, and I've spoken to Chief Resilience Officers in Australia about how they deal with wildfire. At the time I had my initial conversation with my equivalents in Australia, we hadn't seen wildfire in London in the same way, and I think that that learning becomes much more important when you see what happened last year. And I think that because of the use of the internet, actually, it'd be really worth the committee considering talking to some of these individuals from overseas about how they manage that. And it's a whole sort of mindset change. So in Australia, for example, they regularly have regional barbecue bans, so nobody is allowed to have a barbecue. So it's kind of like, so what are we working towards is that sort of public awareness that it's not necessarily an exception. This is probably going to be every single summer from now on that we're going to have pretty high levels of heat. So how do we manage that? We've got to shift how we live, how we work, how we behave in our leisure time to make sure that we adjust, sort of learning what we can from overseas.
Thank you. I'll stop there before you turn my microphone off, Chair.
Thank you. I was just about to say. Can I just thank you all? This has been a long meeting, but I think we've all learned a tremendous amount, and your contributions have been really helpful and informative, and hopefully we will be able to bring lots of attention to the Charge Safe campaign and continue to work together to keep London safe. Again, thank you to all our guests for your contributions. We have a few short items of business. You're welcome to stay for those. You're welcome to go with just a couple minutes. Committee, can we note the report and today's discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the discussion? Agreed. And can the committee note its work program and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the informal session with Matt Parr, CB, His Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services? Noted. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 18th of July, 2023 at 10 a.m. in this chamber at City Hall. I have no other urgent business and now declare this meeting to be closed.
Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.